Year-old named Daniel Dick was on vacation with his mother and his two younger brothers in Hawaii. Daniel had just graduated from his high school in Los Angeles, where he was the student body president. He was known to invite all of his classmates over to his house all the time for dinners, and girls would call him all the time to try to get advice about their boyfriends. And Daniel also would befriend troubled teens in an attempt to kind of pick them up and get them back on the straight and narrow. When he and his family left for this vacation, he had been working part-time at a grocery store and was getting ready to attend California State University in the fall. That morning, Daniel went down to the beach where he planned on doing some swimming and maybe laying out in the sun for a little bit. And pretty quickly, he met three girls. And after about 30 minutes of chatting with them, he asked them if they wanted to climb over the fence and check out the blowhole. A blowhole is a fairly narrow hole that is situated on rocks right near where water is crashing. And this hole is usually formed by molten lava that has passed through underneath. And what happens is this hole is connected to a tunnel that feeds down and out into the water. So when the waves come in, they go through this tunnel and they get rocketed up this little opening, causing a massive geyser of water. Now, if you don't go near the blowhole, it's not dangerous at all. It's just a very cool natural phenomenon. The beach that Daniel and these girls were on was situated right near an infamously dangerous blowhole called the Halona blowhole. The reason it was so dangerous is because the water it connected to through that tunnel was some of the most violent in all of Hawaii. So when those waves came barreling through the tunnel, it would shoot 30 plus feet in the air. And so to make sure everybody understood you're only allowed to watch the blowhole from a distance, they actually put up a fence all the way around it and put up signs saying, "Do not go any closer." To give you a sense of how powerful the water was that was churning through this tunnel, if you were standing on the other side of the fence watching the blowhole from a safe distance, you could feel the ground shaking as the waves would rumble through the tunnel and then explode out of the blowhole. According to Daniel's family and friends, he was not a reckless person, he was just a very adventurous person. And so something like this blowhole really piqued his interest, and he just couldn't handle being on the outside of the fence. He really wanted to get right up there and get a look at it. In fact, he told these girls he wanted to feel the power of the water hit him in the chest. That was his plan. The girls told him this was a bad idea, but he was insistent and he began walking over to the rocks where you could climb up and jump this fence. The girls went with him, but they stopped short of the fence. As Daniel made his way over to the rocks, he passed by a couple that was laying on the beach. He waved to them, he climbed up the rocks, he climbed over the fence, and he made his way over to the blowhole. And he timed it to where a wave had just come in and shot a geyser up, and then as soon as the water went down and there was a break, he walked over the edge of this hole that was not very far across, and he kind of arched himself over it so his chest was hovering right over where the water was going to come up. And initially, a wave came through and the water shot up and it hit him in the chest and it kind of staggered him back for a minute. And at this point, the three girls and the couple that he had passed are now yelling for him to get away from the blowhole, that it's way too dangerous. But it was too late. He leaned back over the blowhole right as a massive wave came barreling through the tunnel. It rocketed up and it lifted him off the ground about 5 feet in the air, and it turned him upside down so his head is pointed down. And when he fell, he went directly into the blowhole. The couple and the three girls that saw this happen described his body position as being the perfect dive. And in order to actually get into the blowhole, you would need the perfect body position because the opening is very narrow and it goes down 8 feet of just this narrow tube. And at the bottom of that, it opens up like the inside of a teapot. And inside of there is this just vicious churning water that connects to this underground tunnel that feeds out to the sea. And so when Daniel went headfirst down, his momentum, along with his perfect body position, forced himself down through that hole into that section that's kind of like the inside of a teapot. And once you're inside, there's no way to go back up again. The opening is too tight, and there's nothing to hold on to. You wouldn't have the ability to force yourself up through that hole again. So the only way out is through the underground tunnel that leads out to the sea. But there are constantly waves pounding their way up this tunnel into the section where Daniel had fallen into. And so realistically, anybody that tries to swim through this fairly long underground tunnel is only going to get so far before a wave forces them back or traps them in some way in this underground tunnel. As soon as Daniel went into the blowhole, the couple and the three girls immediately climbed up the rocks, hopped over the fence, and began looking into the tunnel, yelling for Daniel. And as they're sitting there yelling for him and yelling for people on the beach to call 911, they would feel the ground start to shake as another wave would come through the tunnel and erupt through the blowhole. And they know every time that happened, Daniel, if he was alive, he was completely submerged in water for 30 seconds or so every iteration that this blowhole erupted. By the time the police showed up, Daniel has been trapped inside of this blowhole for some time, and no one's heard him, no one's seen him, and so it's starting to look pretty grim. And the police would say it's nearly impossible for anybody to survive being inside of this blowhole, especially at high tide, which is when he went in. In fact, the police would say, we can't even send divers in there until low tide, because if we send someone in now, they're gonna get killed inside of this blowhole. It's too violent inside of there. And so the best they could do was put a weighted line into the blowhole, anchored on the outside, so that if by some miracle Daniel was still alive, he'd be able to grab this line and pull himself up. He probably would not be able to pull himself through the hole to safety, but at least he could keep himself out of the water until rescuers could get there the next day at low tide. But when low tide came the next day and divers went out to the water, they discovered Daniel's body. It was floating near the area where water actually gets sucked into the tunnel and out through the blowhole. During low tide, he must have been pulled back out through the tunnel out to sea. It's unclear how long Daniel was alive once he landed inside of the blowhole, or whether he ever attempted to actually swim through that tunnel out to sea, but at some point he did drown. Daniel's mother petitioned to have a metal grate put over the blowhole so that nobody else would fall in and meet the same fate as her son. But this proposal was met with criticism from the locals, who said the problem was not the blowhole, the problem was people not respecting the power of nature. And so while a fence still surrounds Halona Blowhole, telling people to stay back, the entrance to the blowhole is still uncovered. A cave in Chihuahua, Mexico, punctured through the ground and discovered this flooded cavern. After pumping the water out and stepping inside of this cavern, they were amazed to see these massive gypsum crystals that had formed on the walls and the ceiling all over this cave. Although the crystals were beautiful, they were far less valuable than what these miners were after, which was silver. So instead of trying to, mine out these crystals, they told the locals in the area that they had found this cave and that they really ought to come down here and protect it because it's this amazing natural wonder. And so for the next 100 years, the locals in Chihuahua, Mexico, basically kept this cave that they nicknamed the Cave of Swords under lock and key so that no one would go in there and destroy these amazing crystals. Fast forward to the year 2000, and two men are inside of this mine, not the Nika mine where the Cave of Swords is located, but a mine that was right up against it. And they're drilling down, and they're actually at the same level of where the Cave of Swords is located. And they don't know it yet, but they're drilling underneath the Cave of Swords. And they eventually puncture into the rock, revealing this underground flooded cavern. Now, these two men are not tracking that this is right underneath the Cave of Swords. So they're not thinking there could be crystals inside of this flooded cavern. They're thinking there could be silver down there. So after pumping all the water out of this cavern, they crawl down inside and it opens up into this massive cavern with these enormous crystals coming out of the ceiling, the walls, everywhere. And they are like 10 times, 15 times bigger than any of the biggest crystals inside of the Cave of Swords. These are literally the biggest crystals in the world, and this cavern looks like Superman's Fortress of Solitude. It's this unbelievable landscape. This new cave would be dubbed the Giant Crystal Cave, and like its counterpart, the Cave of Swords, it would be handed over to locals to protect. Now, you'd think people would be lining up like crazy to get inside either of these two caves to see these natural wonders. But the truth is, nobody wants to go inside of these caves because they're death traps. Even though both of these caves have had the water drained out of them, their humidity level is still 100%, which means if you're in there too long in either of these two caves, you run the risk of your lungs starting to fill with water, effectively drowning you. In fact, scientists speculate that it would take about 10 minutes for this to happen to you if you were inside one of these caves, assuming you were not wearing a special breathing device that was pumping dry air back into you. But even if you were wearing these special air tanks, the cave would still kill you in about an hour because the temperature exceeds 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you combine the extreme heat with the humidity and the tight enclosed nature of an underground cave, you have a natural oven that if you stay in there too long, it will cook you alive. So the only people that go inside of these caves are researchers that wear all the special equipment, and they only go inside for a couple of minutes at most. But in 2001, so 1 year after the discovery of the Big Crystal Cave, one of the workers who helped drain out the Big Crystal Cave decided, you know what? I want a crystal for myself. And so using his understanding of the mine and his access to this particular section of the mine, he made his way down and got inside of the big crystal cave. Now, the only special equipment he had was a saw, because he figured he could get in there and saw off a piece of one of these crystals and get out of there in just a couple of minutes, certainly well before anything bad would happen to him. So he gets inside, he identifies the crystal he wants, and he starts sawing off the bottom of this crystal. But it dislodges a huge chunk of the crystal that falls on him. Now, when it fell on him, that didn't kill him, but it pinned him inside of this cave. At this point, reality must have sunk in very quickly for this guy. He didn't tell anyone where he was going because what he was doing was illegal, and he knows that nobody checks inside of these caves to see if people are trapped or stuck, because they don't expect people to go into these caves, and they're off limits. A couple of days later, researchers went down into Big Crystal Cave, and they discovered this guy still pinned underneath the big crystal he had cut from the ceiling. It was unclear whether he had died from drowning or from being cooked alive, but either way, he was deceased. To this day, Big Crystal Cave and the Cave of Swords are strictly off limits with respecting boundaries. In 1996, when Daniel was 24 years old, he became obsessed with this video game series called Ultima, which in the early days of PC gaming was this huge hit. It was this open world role-playing fantasy game. Daniel figured out where the creator of this game lived, and in the middle of the night in the spring of that year, he went to this guy's house and he knocked on the door. And when the creator did not answer the door, Daniel's frustrated and he leaves, but comes back a couple hours later and proceeds to break a window, climb inside this guy's house. He goes upstairs and he goes into one of the bedrooms where he crawls into one of the beds and falls asleep. The next morning, when the creator got up, he finds Daniel laying in one of his beds and he starts yelling at him to get out of his house. And Daniel's totally unfazed and he just wants to sleep in this bed. And so the guy calls the police show up and Daniel's still in bed. And so they haul him out and they arrest him. A year later, Daniel would be arrested again for trespassing, this time in Orlando, Florida at SeaWorld, where Daniel had, after hours, snuck into the manatee exhibit and was swimming around with the manatees because apparently he wanted to play with them. But despite his criminal history, Daniel was far from a hardened criminal. In fact, many people that knew him described him as a very gentle, pot-smoking hippie who just adored animals. In 1999, when Daniel was 27, he joined a small religious community of people that practiced Hare Krishna, which is a branch of Hinduism. They get their name from their chant, Hare Krishna, that devotees repeat over and over and over again. During his stay with this community, Daniel basically blew off all of his responsibilities. He didn't really practice the religion, he didn't help out around the temple. Instead, he spent virtually all of his time feeding the wild birds that came to roost inside of the temple's garden. And he kept this notebook where he diligently tracked who had come into the garden, which bird, and how much he had fed them, and what they looked like. Basically, all he cared about were these birds. After a month of living in the Hare Krishna community, Daniel abruptly tells the other worshippers that he's going to be taking a vow of silence. And this really confused the others because Hare Krishna does not encourage its members to take vows of silence. This was something Daniel was just going to do on his own. And so right before he took his vow of silence, he also informed them that he would be leaving. So he takes his vow of silence, he packs his stuff up, and he leaves. After departing, Daniel committed a series of petty offenses through South Carolina, Washington, Texas, and then ultimately in Florida. One of his offenses in Florida was stealing a candy bar at a 7-Eleven. And in court, because of his vow of silence that he was still living up to, he had to write on a piece of paper that he denied the charge. But ultimately, he was sent to jail for 3 days. After his stint in this Florida jail, Daniel gets out and he decides he wants to go back to Orlando, Florida, and go to the SeaWorld where he had previously jumped into the manatee exhibit. And so he was going to go and presumably check out the manatees as well as some other animals. When he got to the park, he made his way over to the killer whale demonstration where some trainers were going to be swimming around in this enclosure with these massive killer whales. And witnesses said they remember seeing Daniel in the stands watching the show being just totally transfixed and open-mouthed and fascinated with what he was looking at. But apparently Daniel's biggest reaction to any part in the show was when the trainers brought out Tilikum, the biggest killer whale ever held in captivity, measuring over 22 feet long and weighing over 12,000 pounds. Daniel was just totally taken with Tilikum. So that night, after the park shut down and everyone went home, Daniel came back, now wearing a bathing suit. He hops the fence and he sneaks back into SeaWorld the same way he did a couple years earlier when he snuck into the manatee exhibit. And somehow he managed to go through the park without being picked up on a camera. And he makes his way over to the killer whale enclosure. He hops the fence, he takes off his shirt, takes off his shoes. So he's just got his bathing suit on, and he jumps into the massive pool with Tilikum. When Daniel jumped into the manatee exhibit, he had said he just wanted to play with the manatees. And so it's assumed that when he jumped in with Tilikum, he just wanted to play with Tilikum. And apparently Tilikum was really eager to play with Daniel, because Tilikum quickly played with Daniel by biting his shorts and bringing him to the bottom of the pool and dragging him along the bottom until Daniel drowned. And then after he drowned, Tilikum basically thrashed him around, throwing him up and down, ripping off pieces of him, until finally he draped Daniel's body over his back, and that's where Tilikum kept him. The next day, when the staff showed up and made this discovery, they couldn't get Daniel's body away from Tilikum because Tilikum wanted to keep his toy. And so they had to use a special medical hoist to lift Tilikum up into the air to recover Daniel's body. Daniel's death was ruled an accident as a result of his poor decision making, and so as such, Tilikum was northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mossdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mossdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mossdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mossdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in two distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mossdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will reemerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mossdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mossdale Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mossdale Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mossdale Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mossdale Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mossdale Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mossdale Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again and it had started to rain. Not significantly, it was more like a drizzle, but they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour, and the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, The other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled drown or glory swim, they had survived the knee-wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel, now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end they would find this hidden entrance into the missing link. All they had to do was pass through the far marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you got to figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26. The rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the far marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the far marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the far marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the far marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the far marathon tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers. And ultimately, when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave the 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off, and they now treat Mossdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it. So that's green greasy. The Limpopo River is one of Africa's largest rivers. It serves as a border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and it also happens to be one of the most dangerous places on Earth. A town in South Africa called Phalaborwa sits on Limpopo's shores, and all of its residents know they're never supposed to step foot inside of the dangerous waterway. But not all of their residents take that guidance seriously. On January 1st, 2010, Phalaborwa resident Mariska Buitendag, along with her boyfriend and 6 of their other friends, had been out all night partying, celebrating the new year. They had had a considerable amount of alcohol over the course of the night, So as the sun was coming up, in their inebriated state, they decided they wanted to take an early morning dip in the Limpopo River. So they head over to the river, and while initially they all seemed really eager to get in the waterway, it was only Mariska that was brave enough to do it. So the rest stayed on shore, and Mariska jumped in the river and jumped right out again. And she survived, and everyone was very impressed with her. And so she's confident, and so she does it again, this time going a little bit farther out into the river before coming back on shore. Now she's really confident, she's done it twice, and so she said, "Hey, who wants to come with me for a third time in?" And the group said, "No, we're still good, and you really shouldn't push your luck. This is not safe." And she said, "I don't care, I'm going in for a third time." So Mariska gets in the water, and by herself, she swims out on her back about 15 meters away from shore. She turns and waves at the group and smiles before she is violently pulled under the water. There wasn't even time for her to scream. Her boyfriend immediately jumped into the water to try to pull her out, but he knew where she was, and there was no way he was getting her back. The other nickname for the Limpopo River is Crocodile River, and Mariska, unfortunately, had fell victim to one of its apex predators. But it's not just drunk partygoers that fall victim to these crocodiles. Unfortunately for the residents of Zimbabwe, because of the extreme hardships they have to face, many of them have been forced to flee the country and cross over the Limpopo River to try to gain entry into South Africa. And many of them will die trying. On April 11th, 2014, Zimbabwean and South African police discovered this crocodile-infested cave right near where Zimbabwean residents will try to cross over the Limpopo River. And inside of this cave were the remains of 15 people that presumably tried to cross over and were caught by crocodiles. The discovery of this cave and the 15 people who lost their lives inside of it, while tragic and certainly gruesome, it only represents a fraction of the total number of people who have died trying to northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mossdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mossdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mossdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mossdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in two distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mossdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will reemerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mossdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mossdale Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mossdale Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mossdale Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mossdale Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mossdale Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mossdale Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again and it had started to rain. Not significantly. It was more like a drizzle, But they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour, and the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, the other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled drown or glory swim, they had survived the knee wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel, now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end they would find this hidden entrance into the missing link. All they had to do was pass through the far marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you got to figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26. The rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the far marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the far marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the far marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the far marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the far marathon tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers. And ultimately, when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave the 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off. and they now treat Mossdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it. So that heavily forested, beautiful island, 93 miles off the coast of Brazil, that no matter how beautiful it looks, no one will go to this island. In fact, you're not allowed to go to it because the Brazilian Navy has forbid it. So the legend of this island really began in the early 1900s when a local fisherman was off the coast of the island and saw right on the edge of the forest were these beautiful banana trees with all these bananas that were ripe and ready to be picked. And he thought, I can easily pull my boat over to those rocks over there, hop out, grab some bananas and bring them home, no problem. That'll take me, 10 minutes to do. And so he pulls over by himself to get these bananas. He anchors his boat, he walks up the beach, he climbs up the tree and he starts hacking down some bananas. And while he's up there, he suddenly feels a sharp pain on his rib cage. And he falls out of the tree and he looks down and he's bleeding out of his rib cage because he can see it on his shirt. There's blood on his shirt. Was there a branch that jabbed me in the side? Like, what was that? And he's alone. He's 93 miles from the mainland. And so in a panic, he ditches the bananas, he runs to his boat, gets it unanchored, and starts making his way back to the mainland. But on the trek back, he passes out in the boat. Later that day, another group of fishermen see this boat kind of drifting around near some rocks, and it looks like something's wrong, so they make their way over to it, and there's this fisherman who went to get the bananas, but he's lying on his back. He's clearly dead, and he's in a pool of his own blood. 20 years after this incident, there was a lighthouse keeper that was assigned to work on this island, and he brought his family with him. They were staying in the main house of the lighthouse, and it was going fine for the first couple of days they were there. But at some point, captains of vessels that would drive past this island and relied on that lighthouse noticed that the light wasn't on. And so they reported it to the mainland, and a search party was sent out to check on the lighthouse keeper and his family to make sure that they had all their supplies and that they were okay. When they get to the lighthouse, they find the entire family is dead in their bed. And the only clue they had were these puncture marks all over the bodies of these deceased lighthouse keepers and an open window. So what killed these people that went to this island? Technically, they died from a poison that literally melts your organs within 60 minutes of coming in contact with it. But that poison comes from a very famous venomous snake called the golden lancehead viper that only exists on this island. They exist nowhere else in the world. And so this island has been dubbed Snake Island. And since nobody goes to this island, the lancehead viper population has exploded. They are thriving on this island. In fact, researchers say that there's at least 3,000 of these venomous snakes that live on this island, and for every 1 square meter of the island, there is a snake, which means if you're on this island, you are always within 1 meter of something that can kill you. And these snakes aren't just on the ground either, because their primary food source are birds, and so the snakes have begun to live in the trees and catch birds that land in the trees. Meaning, if you happen to be walking on this densely forested island, you'd be surrounded almost 360 degrees by these wickedly venomous snakes that if you are bit, you have 60 minutes to get the antidote. If you don't, you're doomed 100% of the time. Nowadays, the only people that go to this island are the Navy, who replace the batteries in the lighthouse, which is now automated because it's too dangerous to be there. They go once a year to replace those batteries. Researchers occasionally go there, and you have poachers that go to try to catch some of these snakes because they're so rare. They can sell on the black market for 10 to 30,000 US dollars. But many of these poachers that manage to sneak onto the island just get bit by these vipers and die. So there you go. The British decided they wanted to take back Ramree Island from the Japanese. Ramree Island is a fairly large, totally flat island off the coast of Burma that was a great staging location to fly air campaigns onto the mainland. So it was a great air base. And the British had actually owned this island, but the Japanese had taken it back from them in 1942. And so here they are in 1945 looking to take it back. So on January 21st, 1945, British and Indian infantry stormed the beaches of Ramree to try to take it back. As soon as they land, they have all this naval artillery support just bombing the crap out of this airbase, and it was just a matter of time before they overwhelmed the remaining Japanese. But the Japanese do not want to surrender, and instead they give up the airbase that they were on, so the British take that back, and the remaining 1,000 Japanese soldiers started retreating to the opposite end of the island, to where there was a much larger battalion of Japanese soldiers that they could meet up with. But the only issue with this particular retreat was they would have to go through 10 miles of mangrove swamp where there's poisonous spiders and insects and deep mud, making it almost impossible to move. But they're determined and they head off into the swamp. But what the Japanese were not ready for is what Ramri Island is famous for. A creature that makes poisonous snakes and spiders and insects look like child's play. And they were walking directly into its den. The British troops decided we're not going to go chasing them into the swamp, and instead what they did is they set up boats, blocking positions outside of the swamp. If any of the Japanese tried to escape, they would be there waiting. And so the only way the Japanese could get out of there would be to go to the absolute other end, 10 miles away, where their Japanese counterparts were. So that night, as the British are just kind of hanging out in their boats staring at the swamp, they start hearing screams coming from inside of this swamp, and it's Japanese soldiers. Then you hear gunfire and then silence. And then it would start all over again. All over this huge swamp was just screams, gunfire, silence, screams, gunfire, silence. And the British are watching this like, do we have troops in there? What's going on in there? What was going on in there is defined by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest massacre of humans caused by animals. And not just any animal, saltwater crocodiles. These massive man-eating crocodiles can weigh up to 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds. They can grow to be 7 meters in length or about 23 feet in length. And National Geographic has labeled these crocodiles as the most likely to eat a human of all animals. And Ramri Island has the largest population of saltwater crocodiles in the world, and they all lived inside of the swamp that the Japanese had gone into. A lot of them were bleeding from the battle they were in, and so they were literally alerting hundreds of saltwater crocodiles to their location. Saltwater crocodiles are notorious night hunters. So what probably happened is the Japanese got inside of this mangrove. The crocodiles were immediately aware of their presence, but they waited until nighttime before they started having a feeding frenzy. And over the course of the night, a number of Japanese soldiers had jumped out the sides of the swamp, exposing themselves to the British. And so about 20 of them were captured, and they said that they were completely surrounded by these crocodiles, that everywhere you looked, there were growling, huge crocodiles eating one person, and as soon as they were done, they would just charge after you and eat you. And at the end of their retreat, when the Japanese did get to the other side of the swamp, only 500 of the 1,000 made it out the other side. And so to this day, people stay far away from Ramri Island because there are so many of these man-eating saltwater crocodiles that have no issue. John Chow hired 2 fishermen to take him out to this little island in the Indian Ocean. The fishermen were not excited about this, not only because it was illegal to take him out to the island, but because the last time some fishermen had gone to this island, they had both died. But the fishermen needed the money, and so they went with John and they drove under the cover of darkness to this island, and they anchored a little ways offshore. The next morning when the sun came up, John asked the fishermen to take him in a little bit closer, but the fishermen refused. So John puts a kayak in the water and he begins paddling into this island. And as he gets close to the actual beach, he sees someone come out of the forest who has their face painted yellow, and they're screeching at the top of their lungs. And John yells out that he's not threatening them, he just wants to come ashore and talk to them. And then a wave of people with yellow painted faces come charging out of the woodline and start firing arrows in his direction. So John, in a panic, turns around and paddles right back out to the fishing boat. Later that day, John tries to make another attempt at landing on this island and communicating with the people that live there. So he takes his kayak and he goes down a little bit farther away from where those people had emerged from the tree line earlier in the day and shot him with arrows. He figured he was a little bit farther out of arrow range this way. He lands his kayak, he gets out, and the same group of people come out farther down the beach where they had been before. They see John, they all start looking at each other and they start screeching and running down the beach towards John. John stands there until they come all the way up to him. They don't shoot him with arrows, but they take his kayak, and they don't really know what to make of him. They're staring at him and they start speaking to each other in a language John doesn't understand. And then at some point, a child pulls his bow and arrow out and fires a bow directly at John. And he was holding a Bible, and he stopped the arrow with his Bible. And at that point, John is like, okay, I gotta go. And he jumps in the water, and without a kayak, has to swim a mile to get back to the fishing boat. The whole time, these people are firing arrows arbitrarily in his direction as he's swimming back out to the boat. And so the next day, on November 16th, he told the fishermen he wanted them to drop him off and he would swim in, and he wanted them to leave and be completely out of sight. The fishermen did not want to do this, but John reassured them that he was going to be just fine, he knew what he was doing, and so the fishermen drop him off and they leave. The next day, when the fishermen come back to collect John, they see these people with painted yellow faces out on the beach dragging his body by a rope. No one knows exactly what happened to John, how they killed him. There's lots of speculation about how it went down, but it's too dangerous for anyone to go back and retrieve his body, and so his body remains at North Sentinel Island. The few hundred people that live on North Sentinel Island that were responsible for killing John Chow, they're referred to as the Sentinelese, and they are unbelievably primitive. They are completely cut off from the modern world. They live at Beach was an avid long-distance hiker that spent lots of his time hiking around the Mojave Desert in search of caves and abandoned mine shafts to go check out. Sometimes he'd bring his girlfriend with him, but most of the time he was on his own, and he would stay out for a couple of days at a time. Kenny was constantly on YouTube watching hiking videos and anything to do with the Mojave Desert, and Kenny was a regular commenter on all of those types of videos. In June of 2014, Kenny must have watched this video called Son of an Area 51 Technician, because he had left this comment where he was telling the community that had watched this video that he had had a very strange thing happen to him when he was out hiking near Area 51. For those that don't know what Area 51 is, it's a highly confidential United States Air Force installation that is frequently looped into alien conspiracy theories. Kenny goes on to describe this strange event, and he said he found this cave entrance on the side of this mountain that was shaped like an uppercase M. As Kenny walks up to enter this M-shaped cave, he said his body started to vibrate and it stopped him in his tracks. And he said he didn't know what it was, but as he walked closer and closer, his body just continued to vibrate to the point where he said he just had to turn around and leave, that he knew something was wrong with this cave and he could not go inside. And so he said he turned around and he left. His comment got a lot of traction on this video, and a lot of people jumped on and were like, well, I don't really believe you, one, but if that is true, you got to go back. You got to go back there and explore it. You got to document this. Whatever this is, we want to know what it is. They were basically egging him on to go back and check it out. Kenny responded to his critics and said, I'm telling you the truth. I know what I saw. This cave was different. I go out in the desert all the time looking for caves, and I go in them. That's what I do. This one was different, and that's why I didn't go in it. But people just kept egging him on to go back and check it out and to film it, show documentation of this thing. And so finally he agrees. A couple of months later, Kenny goes back out to the Mojave Desert with his camera, and he films himself looking for the M cave, but he can't find it. So the video's kind of a bust. He still uploads it to YouTube, and he tells everyone that he's gonna go back out again. He knows where it is. He's fairly confident that he can get to it again, but he just needs to go out a third time to go look for it. Over the course of the next month, in the comment section of that video, people are encouraging Kenny and saying, go out there, go find it, we're so excited. One commenter was not so encouraging. Their name was Lemmy Killmeister, and they wrote on his video, do not go to M Cave. If you go in, you won't be able to get out again. Kenny wrote back, what do you mean? And Lemmy Killmeister didn't respond and subsequently vanished from YouTube. Kenny brushes this off, and on November 10th, 2014, he heads back out once again to try to find M Cave. On November 14th, when he had not returned and his girlfriend had not heard from him and couldn't get in touch with him, she called the police. The police launched this massive search for Kenny. They knew roughly where he was going to be because he had documented it so aggressively on his YouTube channel, and so they search in that area, and after about a week they find his cell phone, and it was laying outside of an abandoned mine shaft. Now immediately searchers think, well, he must have fallen into this mine shaft that was almost a vertical mine shaft. He must have fallen in there to his death. So they get a camera and they feed it down into this mine shaft, and there's no one in there. And very clearly, no one had been down this mine shaft in a very long time. Certainly not Kenny. There were no tracks around where his phone was located, so no animal tracks or people tracks, and the phone didn't have blood on it or scratches on it. It was just sitting there with no new information. Beyond the cell phone, they had nothing else to go on, and eventually the search was terminated. Kenny never turned up. He was just gone after that. While it's pretty easy for people to chalk up this whole M Cave thing as total nonsense, and that they believe all that happened is Kenny went out into the wilderness of the Mojave Desert and ultimately got lost and died, and that's fair, I do want to offer up one thing about his description of being near the cave that first time he saw it. He described his body vibrating to the point where he couldn't go any further and he had to turn around and leave. The United States military uses these things called access denial systems around their highly classified installations. Anywhere where you cannot risk someone getting in, like a fence isn't good enough, they use these machines that fire beams at people that get too close. They're non-lethal, but it's like being thrust inside of a microwave. You feel hot and really uncomfortable, and you turn around and you get the heck out of there. The fact that Kenny was right near Area 51, a highly confidential area, regardless of alien conspiracies, it's a known highly confidential base. And he's discovering this strange cave entrance that doesn't look like other cave entrances, and he's walking up to it describing basically what it feels like to be hit with an access denial system. It makes you wonder, did he discover some secret entrance to some secret base? Or is this a bunch of crap and he just got lost in the desert and died? We don't know. But what we do know is that his search for M Cave probably ended his life. And that's why you should never go looking for M. 90s, a man turns on his camera, flips on his light, and starts filming. As the viewer, all we can tell is that he's in this gray hallway. It's very unclear where he is. It does appear to be something that might be underground because everything seems to be concrete. As he's filming, he begins walking down this narrow corridor where there's nothing on the walls or on the ground or anywhere to give away where he is. And so for the first 40 seconds of him just walking down this kind of meandering hallway, it's very uneventful. Then at some point, he aims his camera at what looks like an arrow that's been spray painted on the wall. He looks down at the ground and there's another arrow. He starts to follow the arrows and he's filming each one as he comes across them as he goes farther and farther off of the main hallway. And at some point the arrows bring him to this room, which at first you can't tell what it is. But then as the camera focuses, you see that there is this massive pile of human remains, skeletal remains. The guy filming does not seem alarmed by what he's seeing. In fact, it seems like he came here knowing he might come across this room full of human remains. After staring at this room for a few moments, he doesn't go in, but instead turns and continues following these arrows and strange markings on the wall and the ground as it brings him farther and farther down this other corridor to more rooms with more skeletal remains. And at some point, he comes to a full stop and he's looking at one of these rooms and something spooks him. It's unclear what it is because to this point, he's been very nonchalant about this horrible thing he's looking at. It didn't seem to faze him at all, but something did spook him because he's standing there and then all of a sudden he starts sprinting down the hall. Now, it's clear at this point in the video that he is alone down here, or at least he thinks he's alone down here, but he's running as if someone's chasing him. And he just takes off down this hall. The camera is now dropped to his side. He's not even trying to film what's in front of him. You hear his breathing and it's very panicked. And at some point he kind of trips and drops his camera and the camera comes to rest in this puddle looking right up against the wall. So you don't have a clear view of where this guy is or what's going on. And all you hear is his panicked breathing and his rapid footsteps as he continues to run down the hallway and eventually just disappears and it's totally silent. And at some point the camera runs out of batteries and it turns off. 10 years later, a group of urban explorers would find this man's camera where he had dropped it 10 years earlier in one of the scariest places on Earth. Hundreds of feet below the streets of Paris, France, lies one of the world's largest mass graves. It's known as the Paris Catacombs, and it's about 200 miles of intricate passageways that loop all over the city of Paris, where over 6 million people have been buried. The reason all these people were buried down there is because by the 17th century in Paris, the cemeteries in the city were overflowing, and so the decision was made to move their bodies down underneath the streets of Paris into these tunnels that were built in the 13th century for mining but had not been used in hundreds of years. And so they began packing in all these people to the tune of 6 million bodies before they ultimately stopped doing that. Starting in the late 1800s, the catacombs became sort of a popular tourist destination, but only a tiny section of the catacombs was made open to the public, meaning there are literally hundreds of miles of passageways in the catacombs that are totally sealed off to the public. No one goes in there, even though many people believe in these forbidden sections of the catacombs, there are entrances to additional levels of the catacombs, that there could be as much as 400 miles of passageways in the catacombs just waiting to be explored, but no one's allowed to go in there, at least not legally. There is an entire community of people that are sneaking into the forbidden section of the catacombs by going through sewer drains and getting onto train tracks and sneaking into these little cracks in the side of the walls. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous. It involves wriggling your way into these 13th century tunnels that are unmapped, pitch black, and no one knows you're there. Not to mention, you're surrounded by literally millions of dead people. Once people started figuring out how to sneak into the forbidden section of the catacombs, there's been countless stories of these urban explorers sneaking in, getting lost, and never coming out again. Which is exactly what we think happened to the guy with the camera who saw the arrows and then ran away. His camera was located miles and miles into one of those forbidden sections. 18th, 2010, Ben McDaniel, who was 30 years old, walked to the end of the pier, put on all of his diving equipment, and jumped in the water. He slowly descended 115 feet and came to a stop right in front of a very famous underwater sign. The sign very clearly tells anybody who sees it, do not go any farther unless you are absolutely certain this is the right thing for you to be doing. If you go farther, you're probably going to die, like the 300 other people that have died doing this particular activity. He swam right past that sign and went 300 feet to the very famous underwater locked gate. Now, the only people that have keys to this are extremely experienced divers, and even they don't typically go into this area because it's so dangerous. Ben was not one of the very experienced divers that was given a key, but he still desperately wanted to get to the other side of the gate. So he's sitting there yanking on the gate, and he's getting himself kind of pushed inside halfway through the gate, and he can't quite get it open. And another diver saw him doing this and was actually concerned that Ben was going to get trapped on the gate itself and would just drown on the gate. And so this diver comes over and uses his key, and maybe against his better judgment opened it, thinking that that was better than him getting stuck on the gate. Ben turns to look at him, gives him a nod, thank you, and he, on his own, swims into one of, if not the single most dangerous underwater caves in the whole world. It's called Vortex Spring Cave. From the locked gate, this cave extends another 1,600 feet and goes down to a depth of 310 feet. The majority of this section of the cave is mapped, but there are sections that are not fully explored because they're so narrow, where you have to literally take off your gear, wriggle through a hole, pull your gear through and put it back on. All the while you're barely holding onto your mouthpiece. And so really the full extent of this section of the cave is not known. While we don't know exactly what Ben did when he went through that gate and entered into this extremely dangerous cave, we do know that he didn't come out again. And after a couple of days and no one had seen him, they launched this massive search for him, and they combed as much as they could of inside of that cave, but there were sections that they were just not prepared to go search. And so he was never recovered. All they ever found were 2 of Ben's dive bottles. As a total side note, when I was reading about the Vortex Spring Cave, it reminded me of some of the things that we did when I was in the Navy SEAL teams. And one of my least favorite things to do is when we would be... Heike Dorsch and her boyfriend Stefan Rahman were living their best life sailing southwest from the Galapagos Islands. For the last 3 years, they had abandoned their lives in the city and had moved on to Stefan's catamaran and were just sailing the globe. On August 30th, 2011, after a particular stretch where they had been at sea for 17 days consecutively without seeing land anywhere, Heike was laying down on the catamaran catching some sun when she heard Stefan yell out, "Land!" And she looked up and she saw these mountainous islands kind of coming into view just over the horizon. These were the 15 islands that make up the Marquesas Island range within French Polynesia. Heike remembers not being able to control her grin. It was like she couldn't stop smiling because it really looked like paradise, and she was so excited to land there. The Marquesas Island range were not big tourist attractions because of how mountainous and rocky they were, and the water was not that beautiful Kool-Aid blue that people expect out of French Polynesia. But for Heike and Stefan, this was perfect. They were not looking for mass market tourism. They were looking for authentic cultural contact. And it would turn out that the Marquesas Island range was perfect for this because the locals just weren't used to seeing tourists. And so before long, the locals were embracing Heike and Stefan and bringing them down to the beach for their cookouts and going spearfishing with them. And even one night they were invited into a local's home where they got to be a part of a big family dinner. After 6 weeks, Heike and Stefan had explored the majority of the Marquesas Island range, but there was still one of the 15 islands that they had not yet explored called Nuku Haiba. And so on the day before they planned to leave the island range, they decided to go check it out. When they dropped anchor in the bay that sat just outside of this island, there were no boats, there were no fishermen, there were no people, there was nothing. It was like a deserted island. And so they make their way on the beach and they see there's this trail that goes inland. Being explorers, they couldn't help themselves but walk down the trail to see what's down there. After 15 minutes of walking down this jungle path, they come to a clearing, and in this clearing is this very strange looking village that's made up of all these shacks. They can't tell if people live there or have lived there recently, because to them, it just looks totally abandoned. And as they're kind of looking around, they notice way down the path beyond these shacks is one man standing in the middle of the road. He's this really big guy with his shirt off, standing next to a horse, and he's just looking directly at them. He's not waving to them, he's not signaling to them, he's just watching them. And it kind of creeped them out at first, but they decided that the polite thing to do would be to go over and talk to him, because this is probably his village and they were the trespassers. So they go over to this guy and they introduce themselves, and he says that his name is Arihano and that he lives in this village. Through broken French, they're able to have a semi-normal conversation, which seemed like pleasantries. And at some point, Stefan, just off the cuff, asked this guy if he'd be willing to be his guide on a hunt. He wanted to go hunting for goats, which is something that everybody did on the Marquesas Island, and Stefan really wanted to be a part of that. And Arihano says, sure, I'll be your guide. Heike was a little bit caught off guard, but wasn't surprised, because Stefan had been talking endlessly about how he wanted to go on a goat hunt before they left the Marquesas Island range. But she didn't feel like doing this, so she said, you two go, I'll meet you over at the boat. So Heike turns around and starts walking down the jungle path back towards their boat, and she turns around one more time and she sees Stefan and Arihano walking into the jungle down another path, and they disappear. Heike spent the next several hours just laying out on the beach waiting for Stefan to return, but after quite a while and she hadn't heard anything, she started to get a little bit worried. And as she's starting to get worried, she hears someone yelling out on the water, and from around the corner, Arihano comes around on his boat and he's waving to her and he's yelling for her in French that there's been an accident, that Stefan's been hurt and she needs to come with him. Without another thought, Heike runs into the water, jumps into Arihano's dinghy, and the two of them drive back around the corner to wherever Arihano and Stefan had been. They land at this little tiny beach that's right up against a jungle, and immediately Heike jumps out, runs right into the jungle, and she's yelling for Stefan, and there's no sign of him. He's not yelling back. She has no idea where to look, and she kept turning around and asking Arihano, where is he? What happened to him? And Arihano just wasn't really giving her a good answer. He was just being quiet. Frustrated, Heike walks even farther into the jungle. She's yelling even louder, and still there's nothing. And so she turns around to confront Arihano and be like, where is Stefan? What's going on? And as soon as she does, she's met with a gun right in her face. Heike immediately grabbed the barrel and tried to fight it away from him, and she could tell that he tried to fire the gun, but the safety was on, and so nothing fired. They kind of struggled with the gun, and at some point he got on top of her and just restrained her and tied her up to a tree. And then he just walked away into the jungle without saying anything. And so Heike is expecting at any moment for him to return and kill her. And she even said that she wished he had just shot her then and there, because the anxiety of waiting for whatever was going to happen was way worse. While Arihano was gone, Heike struggled to try to get the ropes off of her and the rope around her neck off of her, but she couldn't do it. And as she's sitting there struggling, Arihano would return and he would beat her up a little bit before ultimately turning around and leaving once again. Arihano would come back a couple hours later after it had gotten dark, and she's still there struggling to get these ropes off of her, and he would hit her a couple times before leaving again. But when he hit her, he actually managed to loosen some of her restraints, and as soon as he did walk off into the jungle that second time, she was able to get the restraints off of her wrist and her neck. Now, she had no idea where Arihano was, but as soon as she took one step, she saw a flashlight maybe a couple hundred meters away flip towards her, and she knew it was Arihano. He had heard her move. And so Heike just starts running full speed. She's stepping on thorns. She's getting slashed by all the undergrowth. She doesn't care. She is running for her life. And because it was a full moon, she could actually see the water because the beach was right next to where she was being held. And so she just ran for the water. And when she got onto the beach, she could see there was another boat out in the water near where theirs had been anchored. And when she looks at the beach, she can see that Arihano must have turned around, because she can see a flashlight kind of bobbing its way farther and farther deeper into the jungle. Using the couple's satellite phone, Heike was able to alert authorities, who launched a search for Stefan. And initially they couldn't find him, and they couldn't find Arihano. But 3 days into the search, they made a grisly discovery. The Marquesan Islands are actually known for the Marquesan warriors that used to inhabit these islands up until the 12th century. And they were known for being the most aggressive cannibals in the South Pacific. In particular, the island of Nuku Hiva, which is where Stefan had just gone missing, and where Heike had just been attacked by Arihano. But historians believe nobody on Marquesas has practiced cannibalism since the 12th century. That practice has gone away. Well, until 2011, when Arihano, who was in fact a Marquesas warrior, met Stefan and decided that now is a good time to bring that practice back. Right after Heike had turned around and walked back to the beach and Stefan and Arihano had gone on their hunt, Arihano had attacked Stefan, tied him up, and described seeing his neck pulsing with fear as Arihano built this massive campfire that authorities said was 3 times bigger than any campfire they'd ever come across. And then Arihano shot him and put him in the fire. Although Arihano would be captured and convicted of killing Stefan, Arihano would never actually come out and say that he had in fact eaten portions of Stefan, and it was impossible to tell from his remains how much had been consumed versus burned off in the fire. But virtually anybody who was involved in this case has their suspicions that Arihano had ritualistically cannibalized. 6th, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura Cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called Traverse before because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. And then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles, but it's also very dangerous and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen, and when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth. But you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just got to have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw. They hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending going down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go, and they go pretty far out. But if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trap diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with, and the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again and ends up inhaling a bunch of water, and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen. He'll probably get hypercapnia. He won't be able to get to the surface and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't. And he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past his dead body. And they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly those three divers are going to get here and be trapped and are going to die too. And so terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface. And he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes at the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other two had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, they're relying on a flashlight for light. There's two dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through, and push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver, who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over. and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital, they would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite and said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plura Cave and retrieve their body. Dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. Now, at first, that was just political opponents, and he rounded up thousands of those. But over time, Stalin just started rounding up anybody he didn't like. And so as more and more people were deported, Stalin needed a place to put them. The option he settled on was sending these people to Siberia, because it was thousands of miles away from civilization, and the way he saw it is they wouldn't be a threat to the regime anymore because they'd be too busy just trying to survive. Eventually, millions of people were deported to Siberia to fend for themselves, and many people died in the process. But the worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. In May of 1933, the first 5,000 deportees that would be sent to Nazino Island arrived on its shores. Now, they had been packed inside of barges. Many of them were weak or sick, and so disease quickly spread, and just by the time they arrived, 27 people had already died just in transit. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And to make matters worse, after a couple of days, another almost 2,000 people were shipped out to this island. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. The next day, they came back in to try to give them the flour, and the same thing happened. And so they went back out to the water, and they orchestrated this plan where for every 150 prisoners, there would be a brigadier. And that brigadier would be in charge of coming out and getting the flour and then bringing it back to those 150. But the brigadiers were all criminals, and they would come out, take the flour, and then not distribute it. And so no one got any flour, so no one could eat anything. And the people who did get flour rations mixed it with water, and then they would eat that raw, and it gave them dysentery, and then they died. Totally desperate, these deportees began constructing these crude rafts and began trying to cross the river to the other side, but many of them broke apart and they would drown in the freezing waters. And if they didn't drown, the guards would see them crossing and would take shots at them. And so if they didn't drown or get shot and they did make it to the other side, they'd be in the Siberian wasteland with no supplies, and they would die there too. And so Nazino Island completely devolved into chaos. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people that were the strongest and fittest of the island who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. And the guards that were watching this did nothing to stop it, and frankly couldn't if they wanted to, because you've now reached the absolute extremes of human survival. One local woman who would make an annual trip to Nazino Island before there were people being deported there made her annual trip and was shocked to see all these people on this island that normally had no one there. And she said from her boat, she watched this group of people run up on this woman, drag her to a tree, they tied her to the tree, and then began cutting off pieces of her while she was alive and eating it right in front of her. And then after the group had left, the woman who was tied to the tree was still alive, and what looked like her partner, her boyfriend, her husband comes over, tries to untie her, he tries to save her, but there's nothing he can do, and she dies in his arms. Another local who managed to save a woman from Nazino Island, she got her into her house and she sat her down, and she noticed that the backs of her legs were all bandaged up. And she asked her what was going on with the backs of her legs, and she undid her dressing, and her calf muscles on her legs were gone. Someone had cut them off and eaten them. Of the nearly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island, only 2,000 remained at the end of the first month they were there. And in fact, when word got out to Stalin that this island had become Cannibal Island, he actually shut it down and moved the remaining 2,000 deportees to another labor camp where unfortunately many of them died as well. And sadly, those few thousand people only represent a fraction of the massive number of people that died during Stalin's many purges. 18-year-old Dalen Pua was visiting his grandmother on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Dalen, who was a Hawaiian native himself, didn't spend much time in Oahu with his grandmother, and since he was here, he figured he would do the one thing he had always wanted to do, which was to climb the island's very famous and very illegal haiku stairs, or better known as the Stairway to Heaven. These stairs were a very narrow, rusty, not well-maintained, 4,000 step staircase that weaved its way up the side of this Hawaiian mountain. It was built during World War II by the United States Navy because they wanted access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and it was not well maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987 and literally put a fence up and even put guards out to keep people from going in. But Dalen really wanted to do this. So that morning he tells his grandmother that he's thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. And his grandmother's like, that's a horrible idea. Not only is it dangerous, but they're going to fine you thousands of dollars if they catch you doing that. Dalen backed down from what he said and he said, okay, I won't go. And he kind of played it off like, I'm not going to go on this hike. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and he made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal and he was incriminating himself, he was so excited about going on this hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. And so the first picture begins with him at the base of the stairs where he posts a picture as he's about to start this hike. And then all morning he's taking pictures along the way up these 4,000 stairs. But then around 11 a.m. that morning, the posting stops abruptly and he hasn't reached the summit. And you figure if you're going to do this hike and you're already posting pictures of just the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you're going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post all of those because that's the prize at the end of this hike. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly hadn't reached the summit yet. And by that night, when he didn't come home, the family was really concerned and they told police. Police launched this huge search for him. They're looking all over the stairs. They got helicopters out. The Navy gets involved. There's no sign of him. He's just vanished. When they couldn't find him after several days, they had to call the search off, and the assumption was, well, you're doing something dangerous. There's a reason this is off limits. He probably slipped at some point and fell down the mountain. That's why this is off limits. It's not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something in this picture. This shot looks like he's just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down a little ways down the trail that appears to be hiding. And many people believe that that guy was following Dalen and at some point attacked him. That Dalen didn't fall off the mountain, he was abducted or killed. To this day, Dalen has never been found, and that mystery man has never been identified. Is Bouvet Island. It is an uninhabited 19 square mile chunk of rock and ice situated in the South Atlantic. If you were looking on a map and drew a 1,000 mile radius around Bouvet Island, there would be nothing else in it. There's no land, there is nothing. In fact, the nearest land is 1,100 miles away, and it's Antarctica. That's not permanently inhabited. The nearest permanently inhabited land is South Africa, and that's 1,600 miles away. The island is so far away from anything that in 1979, Israel and South Africa dropped 2 nuclear bombs on it, and nobody noticed. The only reason anybody found out about it is because a US satellite happened to be looking in its direction, and it saw 2 bright flashes of light, and they were like, I wonder what that is. And then it turned out to be nuclear testing. For the very few people that have gone to Bouvet Island, you can't just take a ship there or a boat there, because all around the edges of this island are these jagged ice cliffs, and then the water is treacherous down near the edge of these cliffs with very strong currents. If you were to fall in, you'd get sucked up and probably underneath some of these rocks, and then you're done for. So nearly anyone who's stepped foot on Bouvet Island has taken a helicopter and flown the long, sketchy flight, hoping you don't hit a storm because you can't land anywhere. You're in the middle of nowhere with no land, all the way to Bouvet Island. And then anyone that's been on Bouvet Island only stays for like a few minutes because they're so worried about a storm rolling in. And the weather at Bouvet Island is famously bad, and storms are constantly rolling in. Oh, and Bouvet Island is an active volcano. So it's this horrible place that nobody goes to or should go to. But a few people still do. In 1964, British explorer Alan Crawford was sent out to Bouvet Island with a team of scientists to inspect the northwest corner of the island where a recent lava flow had created a shelf that looked like you could potentially build a building on it. And the British wanted to stand up a weather station out there, but they needed someone to go out there and give the green light. So on April 2nd, 1964, Crawford and his crew departed South Africa and began the long helicopter ride. When they finally touched down on Bouvet Island, everybody was on edge because you are in the most remote place in the world, and if anything happens to you, there's no help coming for you. So people were eager to get the work done, survey the area, and get right back on the helicopter and leave. So the team immediately gets to work surveying the site, while Crawford decides to just for a couple minutes to step over the ridge and just look out at the island. He was fascinated with Bouvet Island and he just wanted to get a better look at it. So he walks up this embankment and he crests the hill and he looks down, and there's this little rocky alcove that he can see the water. It's at this one area of the island where there's a little bit of a beach. And he sees a wooden lifeboat that's kind of half sunken sitting in the shallow waters of this lagoon. He couldn't believe it because he knows it's not theirs because they came in on helicopter. And he's also thinking, like, how could this boat have gotten here at all? The nearest land is 1,100 miles away. So he starts walking down towards the boat and he sees on the beach 2 wooden oars that he assumes go with the boat. Next to them is a flattened copper tank that's used to catch water. And then next to that was a wooden barrel, which also would have been used to store water. He starts looking around the beach for other signs of human life, and there are none. There's no tent, there's no clothes, there's no human remains. He finally gets down to the beach and actually wades out the little ways into the water to actually inspect this lifeboat. And he starts looking for identifying marks or numbers on the boat that might give away where it's from, but there's no significant marking on the boat. It was in pretty good shape, but there was just nothing to give away where it was from. Because Crawford knew they had very little time before they were going to leave the island, he ran back on shore and he looked around on the beach some more. He walked up the hill a ways to get a look down the island to see if there's any sign of human life on this island, but there's none. And so he goes back over to his team and he tells them what he's found. But his team is so focused on getting this survey done and getting the heck out of here that they don't really care about this lifeboat. And they say, you know what, it probably washed up from some shipwreck or something. There's probably some explanation for it. Let's just get this done and get out of here. Crawford feels a little bit frustrated because he's fascinated by what he's just found and he wishes they were too. So he just walks back over the hill and he takes his camera out and he takes a picture of the lifeboat. After that, he hopped in the helicopter, flew back to South Africa, and he showed this picture to his superiors, and he was hoping they would launch some sort of investigation to see who was out there. But much like his team, who didn't care when they were already at Bouvet Island, his superiors, who were thousands of miles away from Bouvet Island, just didn't care very much about some random lifeboat on some random island in the middle of nowhere. But 2 years after Crawford's expedition, another crew was sent out to Bouvet Island to survey the lagoon where this lifeboat was found, and the crew would report that they found the lagoon, but there was no boat, there was no barrel, there was no copper tank, there was no oars, there was nothing. It was as if it was never there. So while we don't know how the boat got there or how it left, or who was on the boat and where they went, what we do know is at some point, some poor soul or souls were trapped on the most isolated and wretched island in the entire stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It's this beautiful Clearwater spring that every summer when the weather gets really hot in Texas, people converge on Jacob's Well and enjoy swimming in the water. But it's not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It's for daredevils that strap scuba gear on and dive down through Jacob's Well through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 chambers. As you move from chamber 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces, and each of the chambers gets smaller and they get darker because you're losing sunlight, and they just become overall much more difficult to navigate the deeper you go. Imagine you put on your scuba gear and you hop into Jacob's Well and you start swimming straight down. Now there's going to be what looks like the floor of the well, and then at the center of it is a 10-foot wide shaft that goes straight down. And if you swim down through that, you're going to reach the first chamber, which sits at about 30 feet and goes all the way down to 55 feet. In that first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there's algae, there's wildlife, and it's where rookie scuba divers will spend their time in Jacob's Well. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it's more narrow than the very first one you went through. And that shaft, that tunnel, is actually what makes up the second chamber. And it brings you down all the way to 80 feet. So from 55 feet to 80 feet, you are in the second chamber, and it's basically a tube. Any diver that's going to be in Jacob's Well has to be aware when you are in the second chamber on your ascent to not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is this opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber into the first chamber. but it's not. It's a dead end that loops around before you hit a wall, and you gotta go all the way back out. So hopefully you have enough air at that point. The second chamber attracts novice scuba divers and intermediate scuba divers. You still have light coming in, but it's definitely more tight, it's more claustrophobic, and because of that false chimney, it's a little bit more hazardous going into the second chamber. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, which is the bottom of the second chamber, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your tanks on that will bring you into a very small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there's all the silt and loose gravel inside of the third chamber that if your fin so much as knocks it, it will float into the water and then it will blind you. The third chamber is only from 80 feet to 90 feet, so it's only 10 feet of water. Generally speaking, you only see expert divers going into the third chamber. At the bottom of the third chamber is this heavy metal grate that sits over this tiny little opening, and that is the opening to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it looks like inside of the fourth chamber because one, as soon as you go in there, it's impossible not to kick up a ton of silt. So you're going in blind. But two, anyone that has attempted to go into the fourth chamber and maybe has been successful has died. There are literally divers that are deceased inside of the fourth chamber. And after about a dozen people died trying to get into that fourth chamber, they finally just sealed it up. But if you were to pry open that gate and go into the fourth chamber, you would have to remove your air tanks, push them into the fourth chamber, and then you'd have to wriggle your way through while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth into the fourth chamber that, again, we don't even know what's in there. In 1983, 24-year-old college students Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 p.m. They were both experienced scuba divers. They were in an advanced scuba diver class with all the certifications for that. They had dove Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water. They went through that initial shaft into the first chamber. They continued into the tunnel that was the second chamber. They wriggled their way into the third chamber, and they reached the gate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open this gate, and Richard Patton was the first one to go into the fourth chamber. He removed his tanks and pushed them inside of this opening, and then he began headfirst to slither inside of this fourth chamber opening while Clark waited. And Clark would later say that as soon as Richard had pushed his way and had actually made it into the fourth chamber, Richard comes screaming up back out of the fourth chamber. And Clark realizes that he doesn't have a mouthpiece in. He doesn't have scuba tanks on. Richard is desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold because he's dropped his tanks, and he's reaching for Clark to help him get pulled through this hole, and he can barely get out of this hole. And as soon as he gets free, Clark takes his mouthpiece off and he jams it into Richard's mouth. And so they begin buddy breathing. One guy breathes while the other guy holds his breath, and then they reverse that back and forth, back and forth. That's not something you would do on a dive for a long period of time. It's an emergency procedure, and you need to get to the surface as soon as you can. So the pair calms down, they're buddy breathing, and they're making their way back up. They're leaving the equipment that they lost in the fourth chamber, and they're kicking their way up, and they get back into the third chamber. They make their way up into the second chamber. They're kicking it out, and then their heads hit the wall. And they realize they've gone down the false chimney, and what's even worse is they hear that awful ka-thunk, which means you have no air in your tanks. Clark, who had taken a full breath before this had happened, he immediately turns and starts swimming and manages to get out of the false chimney and makes it to the surface before he drowns. But Richard wasn't as lucky. His final few moments were spent in total darkness with silt kicked up all around him. He's got no air, he's got no idea where to go, and he's desperately trying to swim up, but he keeps hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. So Doc Deep was an avid scuba diver, and in 2015, he decided he was going to put his scuba diving to the test and try to break the world record for the deepest recreational scuba dive. At the time, the current record was 1,090 feet, set by a man named Ahmed Gaber in 2014. Guy's plan was to go down to 1,090 feet and then keep going to 1,200 feet, and that would be his history's record-setting mark. But in order to do that, you need a dive site that goes down to 1,200 feet. But luckily, Guy did most of his scuba diving off the coast of St. Croix in the Caribbean, and that area was known for an incredibly deep dive spot. Now, when most people think of scuba diving in the Caribbean, they think of beautiful clear water and amazing coral reef and exotic fishes, and everyone's so happy and it's so great and the water's so warm. And off St. Croix, that was true. But if you continued going offshore about 250 feet, you'd reach a drop-off that's known as the wall. And we're not talking about a gradual drop-off. We're talking about the seafloor going from flat to turning 45 degrees and going straight down 2 miles into a complete black abyss. Now, the only people that are actually allowed to dive into the wall are very experienced scuba divers with all the certifications. But if you're a tourist and you come to St. Croix, you can still scuba dive off the coast where it is beautiful and shallow and warm and there's reefs and fish, but you're allowed to swim out to the edge of the wall. And people report getting out there and standing on the edge of this cliff, looking in the water with their mask and not being prepared for how intimidating it is. I mean, you're standing on one side where behind you is like this tropical paradise, and in front of you is this seemingly endless void where we don't even know what's down there. I mean, we've only explored 10% of the ocean. These deep portions of the ocean we can't get down, so we don't know what's down there. What we do know is that sometimes whales will dive down into these deeper sections of the water, and scientists will be tracking their dive, and when they come up again, after only going down maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet, they'll return with these massive bites taken out of them, because apparently there are creatures down there that we haven't discovered yet that are so big and so aggressive that a whale seems like a reasonable thing to go after for food. And so imagine standing on the edge of this cliff looking out and being like, what's down there? Well, our boy Guy decides, I'm gonna find out what's down there, and I'm gonna do my record-setting dive at the wall. And so after meticulous planning and hiring a support team that's gonna be there to help him do this dive, he, his wife, and his son fly to St. Croix and they get ready to do this dive. Guy had arranged for a line to be lowered right at the edge of the wall that was weighted down by an anchor that was gonna go down all the way to 1,300 feet. And they would put a metal placard at the 1,200 foot mark on the actual line so that when Guy went down, he would reach that placard at 1,200 feet. That's the record-setting mark. He would use a grease pen to mark the placard to indicate, I made it, this is legitimate, and then he would go back up, and that's how the dive was gonna go. And so in the early morning of August 15th, 2015, Guy, along with his big support team, they head out to the edge of the wall. Guy gets into the water along with his son, who's gonna go down with him for the first 200 feet, and he looks up at the support boat and he gives him the okay. He's ready to start the dive, and then he and his son give the signal, they're ready to go down, and they start their descent into the void. As they're sinking lower and lower and lower in the water column, it's getting darker and darker until it's completely and totally pitch black. They reach the 200-foot mark, they come to a stop as was planned, and Guy's son Kip would give his father a squeeze for good luck because they can't communicate, and then Kip would go back up, and Guy on his own continues down to the 1,200-foot mark. Once Guy was on his own, a timer started because it's very important to track how long he's down at depth, and his team was expecting him to be back up at the 350-foot mark in 38 minutes from when his son left. But 38 minutes came and went, and he was not at the 350-foot mark. But even though this is a big problem, Guy had a whole bunch of extra air canisters with him, and so if he ran into any sort of problem, he would be able to continue to breathe air and fix the problem before coming up. It would just mean longer decompression stops along the way up. And since he was tethered to the guideline, they knew he couldn't drift away. And so they just had to wait and hope that he ran into some problem and that he would fix it eventually and then he would come back up again. But he never did. They couldn't really send a rescue mission down to get him because Guy was going so deep. He was the only one that was able to get down there. No one else was qualified or would be able to do it or had the right equipment for it. He was totally on his own down there. It would take 3 days before they were able to get the right equipment that was able to pull this lineup out of the water, and attached at the end of it was Guy, and he was deceased. He had drowned. But the really scary thing about what happened to Guy is when he went down into that abyss, he had all these extra air canisters attached to him. And so presumably he went down the line, probably all the way down to the record-breaking mark, and then he got trapped somehow. And as he's trapped on this line in total darkness, surrounded by who knows what down there, probably for several hours, he just cycled through his backup air canisters wondering, am I gonna run out of air and drown? Or am I gonna get attacked by some animal down here? Winds its way through a forest in Yorkshire, England called the Bolton Strid. It's not very wide, you could jump over it. It doesn't appear to be very deep, it looks like maybe a foot or two, and it's not moving very fast, but that's all an illusion. There are signs up all over the place that say do not go near the Bolton Strid, it kills people. Because just beneath the surface of this seemingly tame water body is a natural booby trap that has a 100% mortality rate, meaning every single person that has ever stepped foot in the Bolton Strid has died. In 1998, Barry and Lynn Colletwer were walking along the Bolton Strid on their second day of their honeymoon, and all of a sudden a torrential downpour starts just raining down on them, and the rocks they were on suddenly got pretty slick, and Lynn slips and falls into the Strid. Barry, being a good husband, runs over to try to save her, and he too falls into the Strid. A man named Desmond Thomas was on the other side of the Strid, and he saw Barry as he was running for his wife, and he saw him fall in, and he watched Barry's face as he was looking at him as if he was going to stay afloat at the top. Desmond said it looked like someone came up and grabbed his leg and yanked him under the water, and he didn't see him again. Lynn's body was found 6 days later in West Yorkshire, and Barry's body was found over a month later, 10 miles downstream. In another case, in 2010, an 8-year-old boy named Aaron Page was playing by the Bolton Strid for his birthday. There's an area that's totally safe, that's away from the Strid, where people have picnics and that kind of thing. And he came down to the edge of the Strid and was running on the rocks, and he slipped and he fell in. Now, an adult saw this happen and they ran over and they were able to grab onto him while he's in the water. But the pull from inside the water was so strong that this person couldn't hold on to this child, who was eventually sucked under and dragged away and drowned. And beyond these two reports, there's dozens of others of people trying to jump over the Strid and falling in and drowning. So why is the Bolton Strid so deadly? If you look at this picture, this is of the River Wharfe, and it's just a little ways upstream of the Bolton Strid. And all this water in the River Wharfe gets funneled into the Bolton Strid. And the way it fits through that narrow section that is the Bolton Strid is the river turns on its side. So when you're looking at the Bolton Strid and you think, oh, that's not that deep. Well, it is that deep. It's at least as deep as the River Wharfe is wide. And if you look at it on the surface and you say, oh, well, the Bolton Strid's not moving very fast. Well, that's because underneath the surface, there is a whipping current. And in fact, the current that runs through the Strid is so strong that if you were standing on one of the rocks overlooking the water, you're looking down into the Bolton Strid. Well, you're not really standing on solid rock. You're kind of standing on a ledge. You just don't know it because the water meets the edge of the ledge. Underneath the rock you're standing on, the water has completely carved it out. So if you were to fall in, before you get sucked under the water, you would get sucked against the side and you would disappear under one of those shelves and go way far back underneath these rocks. And then you'd get sucked under and drown. And a lot of people who fall into the Strid, they don't make it out the other side. They don't get downstream. They get pulled into all these different caverns and tunnels that have been carved out by that current, and they're trapped in there forever because no one's going in to retrieve them, not even with scuba gear. Because if you get in there with scuba gear, the current will push you into these different caves and you aren't getting it. Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. She, along with her flight navigator, Fred Noonan, flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. A couple days later, on July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan would depart Lae, and they would make their way to tiny Howland Island, which was their next refueling stop, but they would never arrive. What Earhart was trying to accomplish at the time was such a big deal, and so when they disappeared, it was heartbreaking, and it made international headlines, and this huge search is launched for them, but they can't find them, and after 2 weeks, they officially declared they were lost at sea and most likely dead. 3 years later, and 350 miles away from Howland Island, which was the island Earhart and Noonan were trying to get to before they vanished, a British scientist was on this tiny little uninhabited island called Niku Maroro, and they made a startling discovery. He found an incomplete skeleton next to what looked like the remains of a campfire, and their skeleton was kind of torn all over the place, like they had been ripped limb from limb. Because of Niku Mororo's proximity to Howland Island, everybody speculated that this has got to be the body of either Amelia Earhart or Noonan. The bones were sent to 2 doctors in Fiji, and they unfortunately said, no, this isn't Earhart or Noonan, this is somebody else. So those bones were ultimately disposed of because no one could claim them or knew who they were, and everybody just kind of forgot about it until 2017 when a forensic anthropologist decided to manually re-examine the measurements of the bones that were taken off of Niku Mororo Island and compare them to real measurements of Amelia Earhart. And they discovered that clearly those doctors in Fiji had made a mistake because the measurements of these bones match Amelia Earhart almost exactly. So researchers go back to Niku Mororo Island and they go to the area where these bones were found near that campfire, and they look around and they find a couple 1930s era bottles, glass bottles, and one of them is a freckle cream, and Amelia Earhart had lots of freckles and she liked to use freckle cream to cover them up. She was kind of famous for doing that. And so they found that freckle cream on this island near bones that look like they belong to Amelia Earhart. So while some scientists are putting their energy into confirming that yes, those bones were Amelia Earhart. We don't have the bones, but we can show you with the measurements and the freckle cream. And there's another picture that apparently shows the landing gear of her plane off of Niku Mororo Island. So there's some people that are working on that angle. And there's another group of scientists and researchers that are saying, okay, let's assume that that really was Amelia Earhart. Let's figure out what happened to her once she got to Niku Mororo Island. And the leading theory is horrifying. Although Niku Mororo Island is uninhabited by people, it is inhabited by one of the scariest creatures on the planet, the coconut crab. They're 3 feet long, they can carry at least 6 times their body weight, and they use their pincers that are as strong as a lion's jaw to rip open coconuts, which is their main source of food. But coconuts are not the only thing they eat. They'll also eat pigs, they'll eat each other, they'll even eat themselves. And they're prolific climbers because they need to get up to get to the coconuts. But in some parts of the world, they use their climbing ability to climb up and grab birds and break their wings with their pincers and then drag them into their underground burrows where they will eat them too. The few researchers and scientists that have gone out to Niku Mororo Island have said at night, thousands of these crabs will emerge from their underground burrows and they'll go looking for food. And they have a really keen sense of smell and they can smell blood. So when one of the crabs goes up and grabs a bird and starts ripping it apart, the thousands of others will come charging over and swarm the bird because they've smelled the blood, and they'll rip it to pieces and they'll all try to get in on the action. And so the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Mororo Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. Today, Niku Mororo Island is only inhabited by the coconut crabs and it's protected land under the Republic of Kiribati. And so if you want to go, you have to get express permission from the Republic of Kiribati, and they send someone to go with you. And there's no airport on the island, so you have to land on a separate island and then ride to Niku Mororo on a boat. But you have to pass through Cyclone Alley, which means you can only travel there at certain parts of the year, and even then it's incredibly dangerous. In Pacific Oceans lies Indonesia, which is the world's largest archipelago. It's made up of 17,508 individual islands that, if you were measuring from the westernmost point on the westernmost island to the easternmost point on the easternmost island, it would be 5,000 kilometers right across the equator. So it spans 1/8 of the world's circumference. Many of these islands are tiny, uninhabited, and unremarkable. At first glance, you might think that about one particular island that's located 2,500 kilometers north of Australia. And I would tell you the name of this island, but if I did, I would be giving away the island's secret. Living on this island are 2,000 people who are direct descendants of former convicts who were exiled to this island. And they share this island with a particular predator that is endemic to this island, who is a direct descendant of flesh-eating dinosaurs. It can grow up to 10 feet long and weigh up to 350 pounds, and its taste buds are so immaculately developed, it can taste blood in the air up to 9 kilometers away. These creatures are so good at smelling blood and death that anytime there is a burial on this island, they have to put big boulders over the gravesite. Otherwise, these creatures will come running out of the jungle and dig up the freshly deceased and eat them. This creature's bite is savage, and they certainly have the ability to rip a person in two, and in the past they have. But they don't typically bite to kill. They bite to create a massive flesh wound so they can inject venom into the wound site. This allows them to not expend a ton of energy waiting for their prey to die so they can eat it. They basically bite you, poison you, leave, come back within 24 hours, and then they eat you. These creatures are strict carnivores and have a voracious appetite where they will eat up to 80% of their own body weight in a single day. They've been known to bite goats and eat them whole by opening up their mouth and ramming the body of the goat into a tree to force it down their throats. But when goats and sheep and buffalo are not enough to feed their appetite, they start eating each other. In fact, cannibalism is so common that their young will hide in the trees for the first 4 years of their life, hiding from their own parents. Because if they're spotted by an adult, they'll be eaten. On top of all this, they can climb, run, and swim faster than a human can. These apex predators are called Komodo dragons, and they live on this one island in Indonesia called Komodo Island. In 2009, a 31-year-old fisherman named Mohammed Anwar, who had grown up on Komodo Island and was living there at the time, decided he wanted some fruit. He normally would just eat the apples that were right outside of his house, but he had always been tantalized by the sugar apple trees that were inside of the fenced-off section of Komodo Island, the so-called forbidden section. This section was, of course, teeming with Komodo dragons, and so as a result, the locals basically fenced it off and said, we don't go over there, they don't come over here. But Mohammed had always wanted those sugar apples. He'd grown up here, and he never got to have one. And so this day, for whatever reason, he decided, today's the day I'm going to get one. And so he goes over to the fence and he's looking out, and there's some fairly tall grass, so he can't see what's on the immediate other side of this fence, but it's pretty open and he can see the trees. They're a little bit off in the distance. And so after looking around and feeling like the coast was clear, he hopped the fence and he ran out to the sugar apple tree. Mohammed's neighbor, Teresa Tawa, was outside and happened to look over at Mohammed right as he hopped the fence into the forbidden section. And so she ran over to the fence and yelled to him to come back, but he didn't hear her. And so she's standing at the fence looking out, scanning herself to see if there's any Komodo dragons out there, and she didn't see any. And so she turns her attention to Mohammed and she's watching him, hoping that he just gets the apples and comes back without incident. And as she's watching, she sees he's reaching out and extending his arm just far enough. He wants to get one more apple, and he loses his footing and he falls to the ground. From her perspective, she couldn't see Mohammed on the ground because the tall grass obscured him. So she didn't know if he's laying there unconscious or if he's just rolling around and he's in pain and he's about to stand up. And so she's just looking anxiously, hoping he stands up soon. And then she hears the sound of 2 Komodo dragons running through the tall grass. She can see the grass moving as these 2 massive creatures are running and grunting at full speed towards Mohammed. Mohammed, when he fell, he had cut himself, and they smelled his blood and they charged over, and Teresa could only scream and yell for help as these 2 Komodo dragons ate Mohammed. The authorities were able to get out there pretty quickly, and they were able to get the Komodo dragons off before they actually consumed him, but he was already dead. Today, you can actually go to Komodo Island as a tourist, but it costs you $1,000 to get a membership fee, and then once you get there, you're only allowed to be in a couple different sections that are totally regulated, and you're really not anywhere near the Komodo dragons because it really is extreme. Set off for a remote desert location about 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas, Nevada, that was within the very famous Death Valley. They arrived at their destination, which, if you didn't know any better, would just look like the middle of nowhere in the desert. But to them, they knew exactly where they were. And so they parked their car, they got out, and they began unloading very heavy underwater diving equipment and began walking it up a nearby hill. The group was made up of 19-year-old Paul Giancontieri, his brother-in-law, 20-year-old David Rose, 19-year-old Bill Alter, and his younger brother Jack, who was 16 years old. As these 4 boys walked their diving equipment up this hill, they were hit with sign after sign after sign that was telling them, do not go any farther, turn around. They made it to the top of the hill and they were met with a huge fence, which once again said, do not go any farther. Without any hesitation, they went right under the fence and began walking down the other side, which was a very steep 30-foot rocky slope that led down to this very narrow strip of water that was the entrance to a very famous underwater cave called the Devil's Hole. Their plan was to dive all the way down to the bottom of the cave, which was at 325 feet. So they get down to the bottom of the hill and they begin putting on their scuba gear, and Jack, the youngest, he's like, you know what, guys, I'm having second thoughts. I don't want to do this anymore. And they're like, hey, suit yourself. And so Jack volunteers himself to sit on the outside and be their lookout. The other three, Paul, David, and Bill, they're totally still doing this dive. And so they put on the rest of their equipment, they hop in the very warm water. It stays at about 92 degrees Fahrenheit year round inside of Devil's Hole. They check their flashlights a couple of times, and when they're ready, they signal to each other and they begin their descent down into the dark abyss that is the Devil's Hole. So for the next couple of hours, Jack just sat on the surface waiting for his brother and his two friends to return. And just after midnight, David and Bill did return, but Paul didn't. And so when David and Bill got to the surface, they asked Jack, hey, have you seen Paul? Because we got separated on the way up and we figured he was already up here. And Jack said, no, it's just you two. I haven't seen Paul. And so David and Bill look at each other and they know they have a problem. And they're like, we got to go back down. And so they put the regulators back in and they turn and start swimming down. Bill would say when they went back down to look for Paul, Dave was leading and Dave was going really fast to the point where Bill couldn't keep up with him. And you got to remember, it's pitch black down there and Bill's got his flashlight. That's the only way he can see Dave. And Dave was creating separation and getting farther and farther away. Bill had no way to stop him, and at some point he lost him. Dave was just gone. And so Bill, not wanting to turn this into an even bigger problem, stopped where he was and went back to the surface. And he and his brother Jack just sit there anxiously waiting for Dave and Paul to return, but they don't. And so at some point, Jack went and got authorities. When the police got the report about the two missing divers inside of Devil's Hole, I'm sure on some level they were like, that's why the signs are there. You're not allowed to dive in there. But they put that aside and instead they contacted a guy named Jim Hoots, who was a professional diver who regularly dove inside of Devil's Hole, so he's very familiar with it. And they got him on scene within a couple hours to go looking for these guys. And originally the hope was Paul and David had found their way into a section of Devil's Hole called Brown's Room, which was this big air pocket that perhaps in an emergency situation they had found their way in there and now they're trapped. So Jim and his dive partner get to the edge of Devil's Hole, they put on their gear, they hop in the water and they begin their descent. And it's totally dark, they got their lights, and they go down about 90 feet to where the tunnel basically funnels down to a point. And through this point, you have to wriggle through and push through. Once you get through that, you enter into this massive chasm that if you shine your light in any direction, the walls are so far away that initially it looks like you're shining a light into infinity. It's this massive, massive space. But for them to get to Brown's room, the first place they're going to look for these guys, they needed to push through that little funnel and then immediately turn left and track the ceiling until they find a tunnel that goes back up again. And that is the tunnel that's very claustrophobia inducing. It's very tight. That if you take it 90 feet back up, you get to Brown's room, and that's that big air pocket. And so Jim and his dive partner, they make their way up this tunnel, they get to the air pocket, and there's no divers. And so they go back down through the tunnel, back into that huge chasm, and instead of going back to the surface, they knew that if they didn't find them in the air pocket, they were going to go down a little ways and see if they could find them on this one area called the lower ledge. And so the lower ledge was just a rocky outcropping that was about halfway down to the bottom of the cave. It was a natural break point before you went to the bottom. And so as they're descending in this infinity chasm, Jim is shining his flashlight in every direction looking for signs of these guys. And at some point, his light picks up a reflection on the lower ledge. And so they get down to the lower ledge, and that reflection was from a dive mask, the glass of the dive mask. It was sitting right on the lower ledge, and then next to it was a single dive fin. So Jim and his dive partner, they pick these items up, they go back up to the surface, and they confirm with Jack and Bill Alter that yes, that mask and that fin belonged to Dave and Paul. And then afterwards they say to the search party, look, we were in Brown's room and they weren't in there. And so there's nowhere else they could be alive. And by now they've run out of air. And so that mixed with the fact that we're finding their equipment strewn about the chasm, it's safe to say they're more than likely deceased. Jim and his dive partner said, look, we'd like to go back in and go all the way to the bottom. We stopped at the lower ledge, so we don't know what's down there. We anticipate we'll be able to find their bodies and we can at least confirm they're down there and then shift to a body retrieval mission. So Jim and his dive partner get back in the water. They go down the 90 feet to that little section you have to wriggle through to get into the chasm. Once they're inside, they keep going down. They pass the lower ledge and they go all the way down to 325 feet. Now this cave is huge and the floor bottom is huge, but it's not so huge that you wouldn't be able to spot two bodies that have just recently landed down here. And so Jim and his partner are scanning their light across the bottom, which is relatively flat. You can see pretty far because of how clear the water is, and they're not seeing anything on the bottom. They're looking all over the place and there's no bodies, there's no equipment, there's nothing. And they're thinking, how are we missing this? How are we not able to see this? And it was at this point that Jim noticed a little hole in the bottom of the cave floor barely big enough for a full-size person with tanks to fit through, that he hadn't seen before. And so they make their way over to it, and Jim says right when he was on the edge, he felt a fairly strong current being pulled past his legs down into this hole. It was almost like this was a drain on a bathtub and someone had pulled the plug and now all the water is draining into this little hole. And so Jim and his dive buddy kind of push themselves back to make sure they don't get sucked in. And Jim pulls out a weighted piece of string that goes out to 932 feet. And he would use this if there was ever a tunnel that he wanted to go down and he wanted to size up how deep it was. He would extend the line and he would let it fall until it hit something, and then he would stop it. And on the line were marks of how deep it was. And so he let this line go inside of this hole, and it went all the way down to 932 feet without touching any surface, meaning it's at least 932 feet deep from that point down. So Jim just pulls his line back up and he looks at his dive partner and he's like, yeah, no, we're not going down there. Not only were they not equipped to go that deep, they also both knew if we go in this hole, there's a good chance we won't be able to get back out again because the current is so strong. So Jim and his dive partner go back to the surface and they say, look, we couldn't find their bodies. But what we think happened is they developed nitrogen narcosis, where you're in this sort of drunken state, you don't really know what's going on around you, and that suction slowly pulled them into this hole, and they weren't really aware of their surroundings, and they didn't stop themselves before they got pulled in, and then it was too late, and they were pulled down into oblivion. To this day, they've never found their bodies, and scientists still don't know how deep that hole is, but in 2012, there was an earthquake in Mexico, so 2,000 miles away from Devil's Hole, that caused a tsunami to come through Devil's Hole. I don't know how that actually works, but the scientists say that's what happened. And so scientists believe that hole leads to an underground ocean that connects to other parts of the world as far away as 2,000 miles. Today, diving is still strictly forbidden inside of Devil's Hole, unless you're a scientist, and they stay far away from that hole. It's very popular amongst tourists. There's lots of snorkeling and whale watching and horseback riding on the beach. But behind this beautiful vacation town, down this bumpy access road going inland, you come to this unmarked settlement called Uluxulwany that is like the opposite of a vacation. Basically, everyone there is completely impoverished. Beyond some seasonal cleaning jobs and the occasional gardening job, there's virtually no work in that area. As a result of this crushing poverty, the men in this town have had to take on one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. It's called abalone poaching. Abalone are a very rare type of shellfish that are illegal to be captured and sold, but there's this booming illicit market for them, their primary customer being the Chinese, who view eating abalone as a status food. Abalone can only be harvested by hand, and one of the very few places you can find them is on Dyer Island, which is 3 kilometers off the coast of Pearly Beach. And so the men of Uluxulwany have become the primary labor force to go collect these shellfish for this illegal trade. On a really good night, these Uluxulwany poachers will come back and make the equivalent of a couple $100 US. And they'll use that money to support their entire family. Mom, dad, grandparents, kids, nieces, nephews, everybody, because nobody else can work. This is like the one thing that generates money. So you're probably wondering, what makes this particular job one of the most dangerous in the world? Well, I can tell you it has nothing to do with the actual act of removing abalones. That's pretty straightforward. It's the creature that lurks below you the whole time you're in the water pulling abalones off the reef that at any moment might come up and strike. In the early morning hours of September 3rd, 2017, a group of Uluxulwany poachers met on Pearly Beach to make their way out to Dyer Island. Now, because they are so poor, they do not have the money to afford renting a boat to take them out to Dyer Island, and so they swim out to Dyer Island. It takes them about 3 hours to swim out there, and then they stay there for 3 hours, going down on a breath hold over and over again, pulling abalones off the reef, and then they swim 3 hours back. And so this particular day, the poachers are pulling up their wetsuits, getting ready for this swim, and they're chatting nervously with each other, doing their best not to talk about the one thing they were all terrified of, which is what's swimming out in that water. One of the men on the beach was a 34-year-old named Zalela, who had taken a break from abalone poaching because of how dangerous it was, but he had just found out his wife was pregnant, and so he needed the extra cash, so he was going with them. South Africa is home to the largest population of great white sharks in the world. Specifically, there is a stretch of water between Dyer Island and the shores of Pearly Beach called Shark Alley that is the highest concentration of great white sharks in the world. So every time the Uluxulwany poachers swam out to Dyer Island, they had to swim over Shark Alley. And then once at the reef, removing the abalones, that's where all the sharks would hang out because they would eat the seals that were in the area. So there's sharks all around them there, and then they would swim back over Shark Alley. So all in, they would be spending 9 hours around some of the most ferocious apex predators in the world. So that morning, Zalela and the other poachers make it out past the breakers, and they head out to this stretch of kelp that covered the first third of their trip. Basically, they would stay in this big kelp field because they said the sharks didn't like to come in the kelp. But at some point, they reached the end of the last bit of kelp. And what was next was this open water swim up to Dyer Island. This would be the most dangerous part. And Zalela was the first person that was going to be entering the open water. And the way they did it is in the open water, they would intentionally space themselves out by a couple of meters in case one of them got attacked. The others would have a chance to swim away and avoid being caught up in the feeding frenzy. So Zalela leaves the kelp field and begins swimming across the open water. And then after a little bit, the next poacher, he begins swimming, and they had this practice where they would constantly be looking around and counting all the people they were with. Because these shark attacks, when they happened, a lot of times they would get pulled under the water and you wouldn't hear it at first. And if there was a head missing, you stopped and you stopped everybody else and you made sure no one was being attacked by a shark. And so as this second swimmer is swimming along, he's counting and he's got a full head count. And then he looks and Zalela's missing. And he yells for the others to stop. And as they're kind of poking their heads up to see what's going on, Zalela reemerges in the mouth of a great white shark that is violently shaking him side to side. And Zalela's screaming out, and the other poachers know they can't do anything to help him. And so they turn and they swim as fast as they can. And all they hear behind them is the sudden scream as his face would come out of the water and then go back down again, and the violent thrashing of fins as a feeding frenzy began. And so the others make it back to the kelp field, and one of them had a cell phone wrapped in rubber, and so he pulls that out and he calls one of the poacher boats, because even in an emergency, they don't call the police because they can't jeopardize their livelihood. And so they call a poacher boat that comes over, scoops them up out of the water, and then the remains of Zalela that came to the surface, they were able to pull those into the boat and bring them back for a funeral. According to police reports, in the last 2 decades, 5 Alluxel-Wainey poachers have been killed by sharks. But to the Alluxel-Wainey locals, they say that count is not even close to accurate, because a lot of times when people do get attacked and killed by sharks, they don't report it to the police because they don't talk to the police. And so they think it's probably closer to 2 or 3 dozen people that have been killed by sharks. When interviewed, an Alluxel-Wainey poacher has said anytime there's a shark attack, whether it's fatal or not, they usually just take a week or 2 off and then go right back in the water. Poverty has given them no other choice. So that's Egypt, overlooking the Red Sea. He had traveled all the way to the Sinai Peninsula from Moscow in order to film himself swimming through the Arch. But now it was looking like that probably wasn't going to happen. The Arch is an 85-foot-long underwater tunnel that connects a massive sinkhole right on Dahab's shoreline called the Blue Hole to the Red Sea. To get to the Arch, you need to enter the Blue Hole directly and descend straight down 181 feet, where you'll reach the top of the tunnel on the northeast side. But there's a catch. If on your descent you happen to miss the ceiling of this arch, which apparently it's pretty easy to do, you run the risk of going too deep. Now, going too deep does not mean you're going to miss the tunnel altogether. The arch actually starts at 181 feet, but then goes all the way down to 393 feet. So it's a huge, huge opening. The risk of going too deep has to do with how your body responds to the type of gas you're breathing. For those who are unfamiliar with diving, generally speaking, you have 2 types of dives. There's recreational diving, where you breathe the same air that you breathe on the surface. They literally jam air directly into scuba bottles. You breathe that and you go down to 130 feet. That's the recommended bottom depth that you would go down breathing regular air. And then there is technical diving, where you breathe a special mixture of gases. Typically it's going to be a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen that allow you to go below 130 feet. This type of diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires all sorts of additional training. Because the minimum depth you would need to go to in order to access the arch is 181 feet, that puts you well in the technical diving range, which means you should be diving mixed gas and have special training and equipment. But year after year, people try to dive down to the arch and go through it, on regular air, and year after year, people died doing it. When your body absorbs too much nitrogen, you can get something called nitrogen narcosis, which is a lot like being drunk. And in extreme cases, divers who get this have been known to remove their mouthpiece and inhale water, believing they are actually on the surface. Below 130 feet, your body absorbs nitrogen much faster, and regular air is a whopping 78% nitrogen. So the risk of getting nitrogen narcosis is exponentially higher if you're breathing regular air below 130 feet. Also, oxygen can become toxic the deeper you go in the water column. It can lead to blackouts and convulsions that if you don't have someone there to literally physically move you up in the water column, you won't recover from it and you'll die. Regular air contains 21% oxygen, which is a lot of oxygen. So if you're diving regular air below 130 feet, you are at an increased risk of developing O2 toxicity. Now, to be clear, it is possible on regular air to dive down to 181 feet and make it through the arch and come out the other side and be just fine. But you're realistically at 181 feet pushing the absolute boundary of what you can get away with on regular air. Below 200 feet, you're probably dead. So if you're attempting to swim through the arch on regular air, you need to be paying very close attention to your depth as you descend so that you don't miss the arch and accidentally drift down below 181 feet to the very deadly 200 feet and beyond. So earlier in the day, Yuri had gone down to the edge of the blue hole and he had found one of the diving instructors that taught inside the blue hole. His name was Tarek Omar, and he asked him if he'd be willing to take him down to the arch to help him film himself going through the arch. And Tarek said, yes, but I need to train you for 2 weeks before you're going to be considered qualified to do that. And you need a special setup with a special gas mixture to do this dive. And Yuri was like, well, I'm leaving in 2 days to head back to Moscow, so I need to do this dive now. Is there any way you can do it today or tomorrow even? And Tarek was like, no, that's not how this works. And Tarek understood this more than anybody else, because in addition to teaching diving at the blue hole, Tarek's job was to dive down to the bottom and retrieve the dead bodies of inexperienced or overconfident divers that attempted the archway and didn't make it. Although there is not an official body count of how many people have perished inside of the blue hole, locals believe it's as high as 200 people just in the last decade. After Tarek was unwilling to take him without properly training him and outfitting him with the right equipment, Yuri thanked him and went on to a couple different other diving instructors with the same request. Will you take me in the next couple of days? And they all said, no, we need to train you and you need special equipment. And so finally, after no one was willing to do this, Yuri just left. Later that day, owners of cafes that overlooked the blue hole remember seeing a young man who was by himself walk to the edge of the blue hole. He puts on all of his scuba gear, he puts on a helmet and then straps a big camera to the top and ratchets it down. And then after he's got all his stuff on, he jumps into the blue hole and he disappears. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's family back home in Moscow did not see him get off the flight he was supposed to be on, and they reported him missing. Tarek Omar was contacted to go down into the blue hole and see if Yuri was down there. Tarek hopped in the blue hole, he went to the bottom, and sure enough, lying face down at the bottom was Yuri. When they brought Yuri to the surface, they realized his camera had been running the whole time, and he had actually filmed his final moments. Yuri's final video exists online, so you can watch it for yourself, but here is a description of what happens. After situating his camera on his head just the way he wanted it, he hit record, and then he jumped into the water. It was determined later on that Yuri was breathing regular air out of his tanks. The camera submerges under the water, and then Yuri begins to sink very quickly into the blue hole. But his breathing seems normal, and he's not thrashing around, so it seems like it's a controlled descent. But at some point, you hear Yuri trying to activate his buoyancy compensator. Basically, it's this life jacket, to describe it simply, that sits on your gear that you have a demand valve where you can inflate and deflate the air into it to neutralize your buoyancy. Or in an emergency situation, you can fully inflate it and stop yourself from sinking. In fact, you'll rise to the surface. But he's trying to activate his buoyancy compensator to slow down his descent, and the air is escaping his compensator. There's a leak and he can't slow down his descent. Now, Yuri was wearing a weight belt, which is very common in diving. In fact, I don't really know of all that many dives that you wouldn't use a weight belt. And any diver knows that there is a quick release function on your weight belt. Specifically, if you're in an uncontrolled descent or if you're in an emergency situation and need to get to the surface, you can jettison your weight belt and go to the surface. But Yuri was panicking and he was fixated on his buoyancy compensator that he was desperately trying to activate, and it was failing. And so he's not going for his weight belt. And then he rockets past the entrance to the arch. So he goes below 181 feet, he goes below 200 feet, and he goes all the way to the bottom where he hits the bottom at 392 feet. And then he begins to slide because the bottom of the blue hole was actually at an angle, and that archway went all the way to the bottom of the hole. And if you slipped out of the blue hole, it was a sheer drop off for thousands of feet. And you see on camera, Yuri rolls over and he's desperately clawing into the mud to stop himself from sliding out of the blue hole to definite death. And he's trying to get himself to stop, and finally he anchors himself in the dirt. And it's calm for a second, and he's kind of looking around. It's very clear he's confused, and then it goes still. And it's believed at this point he either removed his mouthpiece because of nitrogen narcosis, he pulled it out and inhaled water, or he was dealing with O2 toxicity and he blacked out and the mouthpiece came out. But either way, Johannesburg in South Africa lies Sterkfontein Cave. The cave is famous for the fossils that have been found there, and also for its underground lake, whose walls look like Swiss cheese. There's all these tunnels that spider all over the place. Many of them are unexplored, and no one knows how deep the cave actually goes. In 1984, cave diver Peter Verhusel, along with two of his friends, decided they wanted to explore these passageways in the lake, and specifically they wanted to check out a chamber called Milner Hall, which was fairly far down in the lake. There was a guideline that was anchored from the surface of the lake all the way down into the different sections that had been explored, and this was so cave divers could hold on to it and make their way through without getting lost. Not that I've ever been cave diving, but from what I've read, there is one golden rule. You never let go of the guideline. And if you do, it better be extremely well planned, and you should do it with other divers present. Peter was a notorious risk taker and was the least experienced cave diver of the three. When they entered the lake, they were all holding the guideline, and Peter was the third back. And so they began descending down into the lake, and at some point, Peter's curiosity got the better of him, and he left the line to go look at the wall where there was, something he wanted to look at. And luckily, the other two divers noticed it, they saw him, and they swam over and got him and brought him back to the guideline. And even though you can't communicate underwater, I'm sure they looked at him like, come on, don't do that. And they kept going down, and then once again, Peter's curiosity gets the better of him. He leaves the guideline and goes over and checks something else out. The other two divers notice again, they turn around, they grab him and they pull him back, and now they're looking at him like, you can't do this, no more. And so Peter's body language indicated that he got it and he was back on the guideline, he's not gonna do it again. And they continue down and they're getting closer to Milner Hall when the first two turn around to check on Peter, and he's gone. And now previously, when they found him those other two times when he left the guideline, he was just over right against the wall and he was easy to spot. But this time he wasn't. They're looking around with their lights and he's nowhere to be found. And they're not prepared to go leave into one of these tunnels to go looking for him because there were so many. It was like Swiss cheese down there with all these different tunnels he could have gone into, and they didn't know which one he went in. And so after kind of waiting and looking around for a couple of minutes, thinking maybe he'll come back, they were running out of air and they had to go to the surface. So the two men surface, they call the police, they explain what happened. Rescue divers are sent to the cave to go looking for Peter, but by the time they even got there, it had been several hours. It takes a while to mount this type of search, and Peter only had one tank of air. And so if he hasn't surfaced by now, the thought is he's drowned at this point. But the rescue divers go into the lake, they head down to the area where Peter was last seen, and they look around and they can't find him, and they surface pretty quickly, and they say, look, we're just not prepared to look through all these different tunnels he could have gone in just to find his body. Because at this point, there's no way he's alive. He's been down here for hours, he doesn't have enough air, and one of the rescue divers is gonna get trapped in one of these tunnels, and we don't want to lose anyone, so we're terminating the search. Peter's friends are devastated, and they say, hey, can you let us go down and look for Peter's body for his family? And the police said, no, we're banning diving in this cave. 6 weeks after Peter went missing inside of this lake, a group of dry cavers were doing some work in a chamber that was right next to this underground lake. And they were chiseling this wall when all of a sudden the wall kind of collapsed, revealing another chamber on the other side of this wall. They took their flashlight out and they looked inside, and it looked like a tunnel that kind of weaved around the corner. And they shined their light on the ground, and it looked like there were some muddy or sandy footprints that were left as if someone had been walking right there. The cavers were initially terrified, the idea that there's anything living behind the walls inside of a cave. But they stepped over and they walked around the corner, and it revealed this huge air pocket that clearly was connected to the underground lake, because there was water right in the middle of this air pocket and there was no other way in besides, this wall that's collapsed. And in the middle of the water, there was this island. It was like this sandy, muddy, rocky island right in the middle of this air pocket. And laying on the island was Peter. In a stroke of luck, after Peter went missing from his dive, he had discovered this air pocket and he had surfaced and climbed onto this island. He knew he didn't have enough air in his air tank to get to the surface again. And so he figured, okay, I'll just sit on this island. There seems to be enough air in here for me. I'll wait until my dive buddies invariably go get help and come down here and rescue me. He sat inside of that air pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for a rescue that never arrived. Before he ultimately died of starvation, he wrote a message in the sand to his mother and to his wife, telling them that he loved them. To this day, diving is still prohibited inside of Sturkfond 17. 34 U.S. Navy sailors were asleep inside of berthing compartment number 2 on the USS Fitzgerald. Their berthing compartment was below the waterline, meaning where they were sleeping was underwater. They were sailing along through the South China Sea when all of a sudden there is this explosion in the berthing compartment and a rush of cold air. The explosion was a 30,000-ton container ship crashing into them, gouging an opening in their wall bigger than a semi-truck. Before any of the 34 sailors could make sense of what was happening, tens of thousands of gallons of seawater are pouring into their compartment. The sailors were sleeping in what they called coffin lockers, which were these bunk beds where the bunks were stacked 3 high and the lowest bunk was practically on the ground. And so as soon as the water came pouring into the room, everybody who was sleeping on a lower bunk was immediately completely submerged in water, and all the furniture inside of the space was lifted up by the rush of water, and a few unlucky sailors who were in those bottom bunks were trapped by furniture that landed right in front of their bunk. The sailors immediately jumped into action, leaping out of their bunks, pulling people out of those lower bunks. Everybody's trying to help each other out to get to the exit, which was a ladder that led up to a hatch in the ceiling. The sailors inside of this space were very close with each other. Pretty much 24 hours a day, they were always within a few feet of each other. And so that explains why, as the water was rising and rising, getting up to their necks, they formed an orderly line as they all made their way up this ladder through this hatch. As they waited in line to get out of the space, the water was getting so high that they were tilting their heads to barely be able to breathe the space that was left inside of the room. And when the water is really cold, you involuntarily open your mouth. And so water was pouring into their mouths, making it very hard to breathe. As each man climbed the ladder and went through the hatch to relative safety, they would turn around and help the next guy up. And they remembered hearing this hissing sound, which was the sound of all the air being forced out of the compartment through this hatch as it filled with seawater. And then finally, the survivors that had made it out of the hatch were able to pull the last few guys that were in line to go up the ladder. They pulled them out, and then they realized they're short 8 sailors. But they're faced with this terrible decision because they need to shut the hatch and seal it. It's a procedure inside of a sinking ship to keep it from sinking. If they don't shut this compartment, they run the risk of killing more people on board the ship. And so they decide they're going to wait for a couple of extra seconds, and they begin yelling, "Come to the sound of my voice," in hopes that anybody that's still down there could hear them through the water and would swim to them. And then before they shut it, they poked their head down and looked, and they saw a glimmer of what looked like a man swimming away from the ladder. And they're thinking, why are they swimming away? Don't they know they need to come here? And they're yelling to this person, come back, swim to our voice. And then moments later, this burly sailor from Arizona named John Meade came out of the darkness and clambered up the ladder, and they pull him out, and he's coughing and he's gagging, and he said, "Gary Ream saved me. I was behind a locker. He pulled me out." And it dawned on the 2 sailors that saw that man swimming away from the ladder farther into the compartment that they had tried to stop, that they had tried to get back to them. That wasn't John Meade. That was Gary Ream. He was intentionally swimming back to save these guys. But now, in a cruel twist of fate, they had to seal the hatch, with Gary and 6 others still inside. At 37 years old, Gary Ream was a veteran of the ship. He referred to the other sailors as his kids, and when they were on land, he would invite them over to his house for holiday meals. He was approaching 20 years of service, and he was planning to retire soon and move back to Virginia with his family and become a fireman. Gary was asleep inside of berthing compartment number 2 when the crash happened, and instead of going up the ladder to safety, which he could have done, he was near the ladder, He instead decided to make multiple trips into the far back section of the compartment, which is where the most people were trapped by furniture, either in their bunks or in the bathroom stalls. And he went back over and over and over again, knowing full well that once this water reaches the ceiling, they are going to seal the hatch. He's been in the Navy almost 20 years. He knows the procedure. But Gary loved his kids and he was prepared to die for them. And on this day, he did. 19 of the 27 surviving sailors credit Gary for saving their life. Highest mountain in Japan, rising up to 3,776 meters. And it's actually a volcano. It's dormant. The last time it erupted was in 1707, but geologists still classify it as active. Tourists are allowed to climb Mount Fuji, but only between July and September, because in the winter months, the mountain gets completely treacherous. There's snow and ice, and the wind picks up. It's very, very dangerous, so it's off limits. Now, thrill seekers, if they really wanted to, they could climb Mount Fuji in the winter, because there isn't a security guard posted up at the bottom of Mount Fuji checking people in and out. It's on you. If you want to climb it when it's off limits, well, then you're climbing at your own risk, because basically it's a terrible idea. But if you have the right equipment and you have all the right training, it is doable. One thrill seeker, a 47-year-old named Tetsu, decided he wanted to hike Mount Fuji in the winter of 2019. He wanted to live stream his entire journey to the summit. Now, Tetsu might have been a thrill seeker, but he certainly wasn't a mountain climber. He did not have the experience, nor did he have any of the equipment necessary for a climb up Mount Fuji in the winter. Wearing only street clothes and carrying nothing more than climbing poles and his smartphone, he turned on his live stream and he began hiking up the Shubashiri Trail. Viewers began tuning in as Tetsu happily made his way up this ash-covered trail, and then the ash turned into light snow, and then light snow turned into really heavy snow and ice and wind, and then Tetsu began complaining about how cold he was and how he couldn't feel his hands, and his viewers are egging him on to, keep going, keep pushing through it, and probably because of the pressure he felt from his viewers, he kept going when really this would have been the moment to turn around. When you're realizing that you don't have the right equipment and it's getting really cold and you're probably not even halfway up, that's the time to turn around, but he didn't. He pressed on. As he moved up the mountain, the path he was on continued to narrow and become increasingly more covered in ice. And the guard fence that straddled the side of this path was getting to the place where it comes to a stop, signaling the most dangerous section of the hike, which is the last leg up to the summit. He gets to that point where the fence comes to an end, and now he's on this narrow stretch where the wind is just whipping across and it's all ice. And he's trying to walk across the ice with this totally inappropriate footwear. He should have had on at least crampons, the metal spikes that go on the bottom of your shoe to grip ice. He just had tennis shoes on, and so he's slipping and sliding as he's walking up this icy trail, and then he finally staggers and falls, but he catches himself. And you can hear him laughing on the live stream, joking with his audience how dangerous and slippery it is. And his viewers begin to change their tone a little bit, and they're like, hey, you might want to consider turning around now. But Tetsu is totally focused on getting to the top. So he stands back up and he continues to kind of shuffle his way towards the summit on this stretch of ice. He finally gets right up below the summit to where on his live stream you can actually see the top of Mount Fuji. And you can tell that his footwear at this point is basically not able to handle how slick it is. He's basically constantly stumbling. And you can see he notices a little stretch of small rocks that seem to almost make stepping stones up to the summit. And he begins walking over very carefully on the ice to try to use these rocks to get himself up to the top. And right as he's trying to step for one of these rocks, he loses his balance. And on camera, he says, wait, I'm slipping. And then he falls and begins rocketing down the side of this mountain. Now, when you fall on a steep mountain, you have one, maybe two chances to self-arrest. So for example, if you had an ice pick and you were like Tetsu and you start falling, you would want to roll over and dig the head of that ice pick into the ground and basically anchor your knees and elbows and drive everything you can into the snow to stop yourself from falling. And so if you can't do that in one or two attempts, your momentum will pick up and you'll be going too fast and you won't be able to stop yourself. And then you just gotta hope you survive the fall. Tetsu did not have an ice pick or any other tool to help him self-arrest, and he didn't have the training for what to do in a situation like this, so he didn't even attempt to roll over and dig his elbows or knees into the ground to try to slow down. So he just goes flying down the mountain, he's on his back, he's not slowing down, and he knows he's doomed. And he says on camera, well, it can't be helped, before he flies over the edge and falls hundreds of meters down to his death. His viewers who watched this happen alerted authorities, who found his body the next day over 1,000 meters away from where he had first fallen. Unfortunately, every year there is a handful of people that attempt to climb Mount Fuji in the winter, and they meet the 1,000 at approximately midnight Eastern Standard Time. The US government discontinued its use of selective availability. Selective availability was the intentional degradation of public GPS signals. It guaranteed that civilian GPS users would not be able to pinpoint locations on a map using their GPS. They could get to within maybe 50 to 100 meters, but that was the best they could do. Prior to the year 2000, there was some concern that if you gave the general public the ability to use GPS to precisely locate things on a map, that presented an elevated national security risk. But that line of thinking became antiquated, and so on May 2nd, just after midnight, the so-called Great Blue Switch, as GPS enthusiasts refer to it, was flipped, and instantly tens of thousands of GPS receivers received this incredible upgrade. People who were following this development were eager to test out this new capability, and one such GPS enthusiast, a guy named Dave Ulmer who lived in Oregon, decided he wanted to create a sort of GPS treasure hunt. So he got this box, and inside of it he put a notebook and a pen, and he brought it out to the middle of the woods in Oregon, and he got the precise GPS coordinates of where he put it. And he took those coordinates and he went to an online forum and he posted the coordinates and he said, go to these coordinates, and when you get there, if you find what you're looking for, there'll be a notebook. Record yourself in the notebook and I'll be out there to check who's done this. And if your name's in there, I'll give you credit on this forum. And so this treasure hunt went viral, and lots of people all over the world thought it was a really cool idea to use this new GPS technology to create treasure hunts all over the world. So people started hiding not just treasure chests with notebooks, but all sorts of random things all over the world, and then posting their coordinates online for people to find. This activity was given a name, geocaching, and it's alive and well today, and it's streamlined on the official geocaching app. But as geocaching has evolved over the years, so too has the level of difficulty at finding some of these caches. Sometimes it requires geocachers to climb mountains, other times it requires them to dive underwater, and in one case, geocachers in the Czech Republic had to climb into this strictly off-limits 5-kilometer long underground tunnel where the only two entry points were on the two extreme ends, and to get to the geocache, you had to go to the middle of the tunnel. And of course, periodically, this tunnel completely floods. On June 9th, 2018, 4 geocachers in the Czech Republic decided, you know what, we're going to go down into that tunnel and we're going to get that geocache. So they made their way over to the Metalsky Brook Tunnel, which was one of the 2 entry points, and they climbed down inside. The reason this tunnel periodically floods is because rainwater gets dumped in there, and the second entry point is literally sitting in a lake. There is literally water sitting right up against the lip of this entry point. So even light rain will get the lake to rise just enough to where all the lake water pours into this tunnel. And so the day these 4 geocachers are going into this tunnel, the weather forecast called for torrential downpours, flash flooding, and either these 4 geocachers were not paying attention to the weather, or they somehow thought this wouldn't affect their ability to get this geocache. So these geocachers get down into the tunnel and they start making their way towards the center to collect their prize, when outside it starts pouring rain. It rained so much, so fast, that the lake entrance started dumping tens of thousands of gallons of water in on one side, and then on the other side, where this other entrance was at the bottom of a hill, you had all this water rushing in. So it was like 2 huge waves of water crashing in on them. And in fact, the survivors would say, because they were right towards the middle of the tunnel, they heard what sounded like a car or like a train. It was getting closer and closer and closer. And that's when they realized it was 2 waves of water crashing in on them. In a panic, they turned and started running back towards the entrance they came in on. But as they're running, they're hit with this wave, and 2 of the geocachers got sucked underneath, and the other 2 were pushed up and were basically body surfing their way towards the lake entrance. And so as they're moving forward, the wave from the lake comes in and hits them, and now the water is dangerously close to the ceiling, and the 2 that have been pushed towards the lake entrance, they don't know what's happened to the other 2, but they're just swimming as fast as they can towards the lake entrance. And they swam almost 2 kilometers in this tunnel as the water got higher and higher and higher, and they're barely able to breathe by the end. They only had about a couple inches of clearance by the time they got to the lake, and they finally pop out and they get in the lake, and then luckily there was someone that saw them and brought their boat over and picked them up. As for their 2 friends, unfortunately, They didn't get out of there in time and they both drowned. Off the coast of Croatia called Šolta. Only 19 kilometers long by 5 kilometers wide, this tiny island is a short ferry ride and an ideal day trip from Split, which is Croatia's second biggest city. It's a hilly island with these beautiful pebble beaches and absolutely crystal clear water. It's a very popular tourist destination that's actually famous for its honey, as well as an underwater cave that kills virtually everyone who goes inside. On September 10th, 2002, 31-year-old Miroslav Kuklis was enjoying a vacation with friends on Šolta Island. It was a little after 8:30 in the evening when one of his friends suggested they go scuba diving. Because of its beautiful clear waters, Šolta Island is a very popular scuba diving destination. And so as such, scuba diving takes place really at all hours around Šolta Island, but the vast majority of it takes place in these safe little alcoves where it's not very deep and you can see fish and wildlife and it's very controlled. But Miroslav and his friends didn't want to do regular scuba diving. They wanted to check out the underwater cave they had heard about just south of Šolta Island in Poganica Bay. They had heard this cave was extremely dangerous and only expert divers were allowed to go in there. And even though they were not expert divers, they were barely novice divers, they thought, you know what, how bad can it be? Let's go check it out for ourselves. So they convinced one of the boat drivers to drive them out to the area in Poganica Bay that sat over where this cave entrance was. And so they put on their gear, they hop in his boat, they drive out, they jump in the water, and sure enough, right below the surface, about 10 meters down, is this hole on the sea floor. And that is the single entrance into this cave. When you go in this hole, you have to go down head first because it's so tight. And once you go down about 10 meters, you reach this junction where to one side, it leads to the shallow gallery, which is the space that goes down to 36 meters. And there's no other caves or entrances or anything off of it. It's just kind of like a chasm inside of the cave. From the junction, if you go the other way, it brings you to the deep gallery, which is just a bigger version of the shallow gallery, and it goes down to 57 meters. Inside of the deep gallery, however, at the very top on the ceiling, there is a very thin air pocket. Now, there's a few reasons why this cave is so dangerous, beyond just being an underwater cave, which in and of itself is quite dangerous. The first one is the visibility inside of the cave is basically zero. The only light that comes in is through that single entrance that leads to that junction, but the light doesn't make it past the junction into the two galleries. So it is truly pitch black inside of those two galleries. You also have all this silt that's caked to the inside of the cave. So as soon as you get in there, your flippers and your movement, it kicks the silt off the wall and muddies the water around you to where even if you had a flashlight, it's like driving in fog. The lights only pick up the fog right in front of you. You can't see beyond the fog. Well, in a tunnel, you shine your light on silt and you're just going to see the silt, not beyond it. So basically going into this cave, you're going to be blindfolded. Another significant danger of being inside of this cave is after you've gone down to your respective gallery, whether it's the shallow or the deep gallery, when you're going back up again on your ascent and you're getting to that junction point, it is possible to confuse the other entrance to the other gallery with the exit to the cave. And so if you make that mistake and you go into the other gallery, remember, you're blind, you got silt kicked up, it's already dark. You need to, by touch, figure out you've made a mistake and then backtrack and go out the right way you came. And so if you're low on air and you make this mistake, you better hope you catch it fast enough that you can get out before your air runs out. So a little after 9:15 p.m., Miroslav goes in first, followed by his other two friends. Miroslav reaches the junction and he turns towards the deep gallery. He goes all the way down to 57 meters, he touches the bottom, he turns around, and he starts making his ascent. On the way up, he gets to the junction, and he makes the critical mistake of going into the shallow gallery, believing that is the exit to the cave. He probably got in there, bumped his head, started feeling around, he's kicking up silt, he's starting to panic, he's looking for the way out again. He finds the exit to the junction, but instead of taking the exit out of the cave, he makes the same mistake again and goes into the deep gallery. And now he's in the deep gallery, he's feeling around, he's running low on air, and based on his dive computer, he was fumbling around in there for quite some time. And having spent some time underwater myself in the pitch black as a Navy SEAL, I can tell you that it's very easy to imagine, it'd be so easy to stay calm and have your bearings and know where you are. But when you are completely in total pitch black underwater, it actually is hard to tell what's up, what's down. You can feel the pressure in your ears. That's a good way to tell where you are in the water. But, realistically, it's totally possible to get completely disoriented underwater. And my guess is Miroslav was totally disoriented, and so he stopped and he's trying to make sense of what's happening. And at some point, Miroslav must have looked at his air gauge and realized, I'm out of air now. And he made one last push to try to get to the surface, but he hit a ceiling. And that's when he realized, based on maybe the touch and feel, maybe he took his gloves off and he was feeling around, he felt that he was in the air pocket, that thin amount of air that sat right at the top of the deep gallery. He must have realized at this point that there was so little air down here that he probably only had maybe a few minutes that he could be down here breathing before he was going to drown. And in terms of making his ascent to the surface on a breath hold, the only place where there's an air pocket is the deep gallery. And so probably he knew that. And so he's thinking, I'm, maybe 40, 50 meters under the surface right now, and I can barely catch my breath now. I'm not going to be able to hold my breath to the surface. And so staring down a certain horrific drowning death, he pulled out his dive knife and he plunged it into his heart. And when they did his autopsy later, it would show he did not drown. He died because he had a knife in his heart. Back on the surface, the other two divers had gotten out successfully and they're in the boat and they're waiting for Miroslav. But after over an hour went by and he hadn't surfaced, they contacted the police. The police show up and they send two special divers down into the cave to look for Miroslav. One of those divers was a 25-year-old named Oliver Maric. And so these two divers go down and they're looking for Miroslav and they can't find him and they're running out of air. And on their ascent, Oliver Maric makes the same mistake that Miroslav did and gets trapped inside of the shallow gallery. The other diver initially made that mistake but managed to get out again, but Oliver went back and forth between the deep and the shallow gallery until he too drowned in that cave. It would take 3 days for the police to find and remove Miroslav and Oliver from this cave. And to this day, the police warn divers not to go in this cave unless they're experienced enough to be going in there. But year after year, inexperienced divers try their luck inside of this cave and they make that same mistake. They get trapped and they die. So that's going to do from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen. And so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point, they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map, and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But I mean, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute, and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated, and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense, and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders, and for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son, and he puts his son down by a tree, and he sits down next to him, and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree, and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see, and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline, and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest, and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. You know, this is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, you know, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, you know, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found, at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, you know, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take